Tere päevast! Mul on
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to open another IT Innovation Festival of TalTech. As today we will be talking about AI, then I could be replaced with a robot. You know, there are news anchors that are robots these days. But in order to make you happier, you will have me as the moderator for today, and my name is Anna Bichl. Today we will have a very busy day. We will have interesting presentations coming up from top-notch speakers. You could already see their names on the screens. And of course, we ask you all to share your ideas. If you have any questions, you can submit them over the worksup.com environment. You can also raise your hand, you can get the mic, and you can ask your question. Those of you who do not understand Estonian, you can listen to simultaneous interpretation done by real people, not robots. But without further ado, let me now ask Mr. Gert Järvan, the Dean of the School of IT of TalTech, to come to the stage to utter the opening words. Hello, everybody. And I am also a physical person, not a hologram or anything else. Today we will be talking about AI. AI, or artificial intelligence in English. This is artificial mind. You can call it whatever, similar to that. But we are aiming to demystify this AI because AI as a topic or as a phenomenon is something that has been around for decades already. AI has survived several winters, so to speak. Scientists have researched AI considerably, and then they have started to look into how to apply AI. And by now it seems that AI can already be applied or implemented, but like with any other technology, there are certain risks and challenges related to AI as well. Today, when we are looking into the details or the mechanics of AI, we would like to turn our attention to the related risks, challenges, and in order to understand the latter better, we also have to understand ourselves better. So I am extremely delighted to see that we have convened very different perspectives for today. Some are more academic, some are less academic. There are also people that I wouldn't say are AI pessimists, but they are those that really question AI and ask, what shall we do with AI in the end? I hope that today we will have pleasant discussions both with you and with other participants, and later on we will have a panel discussion on this topic as well. So in the end of today, hopefully we will all understand AI better as to what can we expect from it, what are the related challenges, and how it should ultimately make our lives better. In Estonia, we have also been talking a lot in the public sector, for example, that AI could be something that in the future will help simplify our life and make it cheaper and quicker. And this is the direction that the world is moving in. AI as our enabler, as our supporter, as our assistant with many processes. But once again, let me remind you that AI is not an end in itself. It is created by people, and we, the people, have to control it. So hereby I will conclude. You will not see the physical person anymore. That is me, but another one will come up, and you will see physical people all day long here that will talk about AI, the artificial world. So I wish all of you an enjoyable day here. Be active and please challenge our speakers. Thank you very much. And now we have come to the first presentation. What is trustworthy AI? The Professor of Trustworthy Software Technologies, Department of Software Science, Mr. Pavel Sobocinski, knows the answer to that question. He thinks that trustworthy AI could become the brand for Estonia. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to see that you have all gathered here. Before I will start my presentation in English, I would like to talk about why TalTech is a good university where AI or trustworthy AI could be applied.
First big Estonian presentation. So when I first came to TalTech at the end of 2019, I was really excited to learn that many of my colleagues study topics which kind of fit into this idea of building this future idea of trustworthy AI. So today I will talk about trustworthy AI. I'll explain what it is, why it's important, and how we should evolve, how we should work on it and build it up here at TalTech in Estonia. So let me start with trustworthiness. So what does it mean? I mean, why is it important for us to trust AI? So of course, when we use AI in our day-to-day lives nowadays, I mean, let's say using a music streaming service or a video streaming service, the risks of you getting a recommendation which is not what you like is a small risk, right? Nobody cares. But of course, the more risky thing is that AI is already being used in places where, the results of the decisions have high stakes. So, for example, educational attainment, things like, we're using AI, maybe not we, but people use AI algorithms to automatically grade exams, even essays. Access to credit. Banks and financial institutions use your financial data to make decisions on whether to award you a loan or a mortgage. Things like employment decisions. So there are already businesses that, pre-scan CVs and AI algorithms decide whether to push these CVs ahead or not. Healthcare. So I know we'll have some talks about this later today, but clearly more and more doctors will have access to AI tools to help in the diagnostics. Criminal justice. But so let me not get too stuck on all these areas, but you get the idea that these are very important areas where decisions matter, right? And we need to be able to trust AI where it's used to make these decisions. In the future, I think we'll get even more safety critical. So, self-driving cars when they eventually arrive, things like robotic surgery or even things like, military uses of AI. And of course, there is also this concept of artificial general intelligence. So this idea that we're moving towards building some kind of super intelligent AI that, may decide one day that actually doesn't really need us around anymore and doesn't want to be switched off and just gets rid of us. So in this talk, I'm going to mostly talk about sort of the first bullet points, right? So the kinds of techniques that are already being used in our society and more are becoming widely adopted. So my next slide is, let's identify what does it mean to be trustworthy. What kind of things does AI have to demonstrate in order for us to trust it? So the first and the obvious one is competence, right? So we build these AI systems to solve certain tasks, to make certain decisions. We want to know that they actually work, right? It's not a silly question. Does it actually work? How can we check that it actually does what it's supposed to do? Then you can get into reliability. So for example, is it robust under various operating conditions? So we had a really rough winter in Tallinn, and I've seen many of these delivery robots get stuck in the snow. When AI makes decisions regarding human beings, we want to know, is it fair? How can we check that it's being fair? Is it secure? Can malicious actors break in, change the data, make the AI system make its decisions for their benefit and not the benefit of the users? Next, there's human friendliness, right? For us to be able to trust AI, we need to be able to understand the decisions that it makes. So when are the decisions being made, and why are certain decisions being made? So can we explain why it does what it does? So I'll say a little bit more about that later. And finally, and this is very important, we don't want to, AI is exciting technology. There's no doubt there's a lot of hype around it. And the hype is somewhat justified, right? Because civilization is the result of human intelligence. And AI promises to augment human intelligence, therefore helping us to build a better society. But of course, unfortunately, there are also areas where AI can be used where, where you have to be a little bit more careful, and I'll say a little bit more about that later too. So we want to avoid a future dystopia. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize is we need to start demystifying AI. Okay, so sometimes AI might seem slightly magical. We don't understand what it does. It just magically does everything, and as soon as you stick the word AI on something, it's great. But as I said, especially sort of in this area of AI known as supervised learning, which is usually the kinds of systems that are used for those sort of first bullet points. The kinds of applications that we might start seeing in e-government and in the public sector. There are already quite standard approaches to engineering these applications, right? And so here I have a particular schematic. It's called CRISP-DM, Cross-Industry Standard Process for Data Mining. I'm not going to go into the details of what this means, but my point is that I have 2 points. The first point is that we already understand how to build these systems, right? And therefore, there is an engineering practice emerging. And I think this is an opportunity for policymakers to understand these processes and perhaps start enforcing some kind of standards, right? So, for example, my second point is that all AI depends on data, right? AI is just computer algorithms that take in sometimes massive amounts of data, model from it, so that later, with new data, it can make the appropriate decisions. But so, for example, in the evaluation stage, one might enforce that to keep some of the training sets, the data that's actually used for learning, some of it to be kept apart and tested, right? So that would ensure at least that we have some idea of how competent these systems that are proposed are. But so my second big point is, of course, data is extremely important. So AI auditing is an extremely difficult problem, right? So these algorithms, these applications, they really live and die based on the quality of the data that they learn from. And there's an old computer science buzzword, old computer science adage, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if I give, no matter how good your algorithm is, if I give it junk data, I'll get junk as a result. Now, unfortunately, when you start dealing with data in real-world settings, such as, let's say, e-government or the public sector, these data sets are often quite biased. So there's all kinds of biases. I'm not going to bore you with the differences between them. But the point is that we need to train students, we need to train the future generation to be able to, the future generation of data scientists, to be able to understand these biases and know how to mitigate them. There's also something to be said about actually studying how these algorithms work, right? Because learning algorithms are also quite fragile in how data is fed to them. So one thing that you have to, for example, worry about is something called initialization bias, in which these learning algorithms prioritize more the data at the start of the learning process. So as I said at the start, this idea of kind of auditing the system is sometimes very difficult. Next, I want to say a few words about security and privacy. So cybersecurity is absolutely fundamental. So here at TalTech, we have a very strong cybersecurity group, which keeps getting stronger. And we're very well posed to educate students and to help in, as AI is rolled out in Estonia. So why is cybersecurity important? Well, for several reasons. One is that, as I said, AI is extremely data critical, right? So if an attacker can get access to the data and modify it, then the attacker could possibly make the AI take decisions in the attacker's favor, right? And that's what we want to prevent. So things like data injection, modification, logic corruption. So logic corruption is even more serious. This is when the attacker actually changes the algorithm. And this whole sort of involvement of cybersecurity in AI has led to the study of techniques, sort of a wide range of techniques under the umbrella of adversarial training. The next thing I want to address is privacy. So privacy is also fundamental, right? So especially if we think of AI being used in the public sector, in e-government, we don't want citizens' data to leak, right? So there are various techniques for this, various notions of anonymization. There is active research on this topic. I have colleagues who work on something called differential privacy. So these are really clever techniques based on probability theory that slightly modify data so that even though the entire corpus of data still has the same value to the learning algorithm, one can't pull out information about particular people. The next thing I want to talk about is uncertainty. So we're taking these AI algorithms and putting them in real-world situations. So we need to understand first, and hopefully quantify second, the kinds of risks that are taken. So you might have heard of these terms, false negatives, true negatives, false positive, true positives, right? So AI, as I said, I mean, the overall framework is very simple, right? It takes some data and makes a decision, yes or no. So the things that we should worry about are false negatives and false positives, right? A false negative is when the algorithm says no, but the answer is yes. And a false positive is when the algorithm says yes, but the answer is really no. So how do we measure risk? Well, we need to take account the possibilities, the probabilities of these false negatives, false positives, understand what's the cost associated with making these wrong decisions, and then quantify the risk. So again, I have a mathematical background. I'm a theoretical computer science, so I'm a theoretical computer scientist. So I'm always kind of interested in these fun theoretical and mathematical issues. And one of them is understanding the interplay between probability and non-determinism, right? Because there are two different kinds of risks in these systems. So some risks that can be quantified, so this is sometimes known as aleatoric uncertainty from alea, which is the Latin word for dice. So this is like, I throw a coin 1,000 times. More or less, I can be pretty sure that I'll get around 500 heads and 500 tails, right? That's because the probability is very close to 50%. On the other hand, some risks are unknown, and so epistemic uncertainty. So in these cases, it's, first of all, there might be some probability, but we don't know what it is. Or, even worse, it might actually be dangerous to assign probabilities, right? So for example, let's say we're designing a delivery robot in Tallinn. We don't want the robot to sort of make its decisions based on probability of weather events, let's say, because it should be able to react to whatever weather events, especially in Estonia. Okay, so just a few more things. Explainability and causality. This is a really huge area right now. The idea is that in order for humans to accept AI, humans need to have some kind of interaction with the AI, right? The AI cannot be just a black box that in its infinite wisdom makes its decisions, right? We need to be able to tell when decisions are made, why they are made, and how to present these decisions, right? So for example, one of the issues is causal modeling, right? Because humans like to understand things in terms of cause and effect. So there are sophisticated algorithms that take probabilistic data and derive causal information. So I'm running really short of time. Finally, but certainly not least, this is what I was alluding to at the start when I was talking about, we don't want to create a dystopia. So this photo is from one of my favorite movies. It's Alfonso Cuarón's Children of Men. So we don't want to build a terrible place for our kids and grandkids, right? So there are certain areas where AI just should not be used. So I'm not going to go through them one by one, but you get the idea. So I've got 10 seconds left, so let me just make a pitch here. I really think that somehow TalTech in Estonia is in a really good place to work on this topic. I think this could be sort of the Estonian thing of the future. So it's a grand challenge for us in academia and industry and public sector. And I'm out of time, so I'll just try to say this in 20 seconds. Why Estonia? Well, we all know that Estonia has a track record of delivering e-services. The e-government services here are amazing, right? So for all you guys, this is normal, but for me, who came here in 2019, I was really blown away by how cool things are in this area. It's a cybersecurity frontier, and government has traditionally been quite friendly to ICT innovation. And why TalTech? Well, we have already strengths in areas that are really relevant for this area, for trustworthy AI. And as you'll see, many of my colleagues will present some really exciting applications. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pavel, for this interesting presentation. But now it's time for our first video. Well, today we will watch different videos about what Estonians have been doing in the area of AI. And the video clip we will see first is about robots in hospital and how they help the doctors to diagnose Parkinson's disease. And it's the Department of Software Science and Sven Nõmm, as well as Tartu University neurology professor Pille Taba, who will be presenting this.
nüüd ongi meil...
And now Sven Nõmm is here, he's present here, and as nobody has asked him questions, I will ask the question myself. I couldn't quite grasp, how does the robot help to diagnose Parkinson's disease? So are they using sensors somehow, or how do you do it? Thank you. Well, in fact, the robot does not diagnose, but there's a program that is based on AI that diagnoses. But what the robot does is that robots make lives of nurses and doctors easier, and robots, they can carry out all the motoric tests that help to diagnose the Parkinson's disease. And now, once the patient arrives to see the doctor, then the doctor can define whether it's the tremor or any other diagnosis that is true about this patient, or maybe some kind of a decision is taken about the cure. So while you said that the reason for using robots in medicine is that the medical personnel is overloaded, well, yes, basically, even if the number of medical workers will remain the same, the total workload of these people will be smaller when using robots. What about the system that follows the robots? Is it possible to define it when watching videos? Because we have been speculating about whether Vladimir Putin has Parkinson or not. Well, basically, when we developed the system, we developed it for Estonian hospitals and outpatient clinics. So it's mainly for Estonians, and we can't send this robot to diagnose elsewhere. And our next video is about how does AI support cyber defense experts to discover cyber attacks, and the speakers are Professor Tanel Tammet from Department of Software Science and the Director of Business Development from Cybernetica, Baldur Kubo.
Ja üks probleem, mis küberkaitsetel on, et kõik nende tarkvarasüsteemid annavad väga palju häireid kogu aeg, ütlevad, et mingid asjad võib-olla on rünnakud või midagi ohtlikku. Ja sinna läheb hästi palju aega, et need kõiki läbi vaadata, ja enamasti need ei ole tegelikult ohtlikud. Ja nüüd selleks, et seda inimtööjõudu või hõlbustada või teha kergemaks, tegime Tarkvarateaduse Instituudis eelmine aasta koos küberkaitsete ja masinaõppe uurijatega sellise projekti, et kas õnnestub küberkaitse sellist jälgimise tööd ära õppida, et süsteem õpiks ära, et millised need hoiatused on tegelikult siis ohtlikud ja millised tegelikult ei ole. Sellist uuringut on varem ka tehtud teiste gruppide poolt, aga mitte väga palju, sellepärast et üsna raske on tegelikult pääseda ligi sellisele reaalsele küberkaitse igapäevasele tööle. Ja Tehnikaülikoolis meil just on selline tõeline küberkaitsekeskus, mis tegelikult ka tegeleb küberkaitsega. Nii et me saimegi siis reaalselt seda masinõppet teha päris inimeste ja päris andmete pealt. Ja selle juures on alati niimoodi, et kui sa teed seda ühes süsteemis või ühtede inimestega, see ei pruugi töötada teiste jaoks. Ja seepärast me tegime kogu selle projekti vältel aktiivset koostööd Cybernetica aktsiaseltsiga, kellel on küllalt sarnane projekt, aga mitte nende enda tarbeks, vaid väliste suurte organisatsioonide tarbeks. Ja me siis selle töö käigus kogu aeg vahetasime infot, et millised meetodid töötavad paremini, millised halvemini, ja me siis katsetasime ka üksteise süsteeme ja tehnikaid teises grupis, et vaadata, kas need asjad töötavad mujal ka. Ja ma arvan, et see koostöö tegi kogu selle tulemuse oluliselt paremaks ja usaldusväärsemaks, kui oleks üksi olnud.
Cybernetica uurib ja arendab kõrgete turva-, terviklus- või käideldavusnõuetega infosüsteeme. Minu roll on leida neid, kellel on mure ja aidata muret lahendada uurimustöö tehnoloogilise lahenduse või nende kombinatsiooniga. Aitasin eelmisel aastal käima lükata ja juhtida Euroopa Kosmoseagentuuri ESA projekti Minerva. Uurime seal koostöös TalTechi IT-teadlastega, kuidas rakendada masinõpet küberkaitse spetsialistide tööaja kokkuhoidmiseks. See tähendab, et masinõppemeetoditega leitakse firmade võrguliikluses ebatavalisi mustreid ning samuti koolitatakse küberkaitse teenuseid pakkuvate ettevõtete spetsialiste. Masinõppe rakendamisel tuleb lahendada palju kaasuvaid probleeme. Muidugi jääb põhiküsimuseks, kas selles tiigis on üldse kala, ehk kas andmetes on seosed, mida saab masinõppega leida. Kui andmed sisaldavad konfidentsiaalset või privaatset infot, peab alustama riski hindamisest ja privaatsustoime kaalutlemisest. Kui andmetele juba pääseb ligi, siis on kõigepealt vaja aru saada andmete kvaliteedi. Selleks on seoste otsimiseni jõuda läheb vaja 70% tööst kogu andmete analüüsiks ettevalmistamise, puhastamise, teisendamise, ühendamise, huvipakkuta gruppide nimetamise, tähendusruumi korraldamisega. Küberneetika keskendub masinõppes konfidentsiaalsete või privaatsete andmetega valdkondadele, nagu küberkaitse, meditsiin või finantsvaldkond ja muud. Valiku põhjus on seostes privaatsuskaitse tehnoloogiate alase uurimustööga, kus küberneetika on arendanud välja meetodid ja tööriistad andmete analüüsiks ilma andmeid nägemata. Küberneetika on arendanud välja meetodid ja tööriistad andmete analüüsiks ilma andmeid nägemata. Uurimussuund, millega aitame kõiki, kellel on vaja andmeid masinõppe katsetamiseks või kasutada konfidentsiaalseid andmeid uute infosüsteemide arenduseks ja testimiseks, on sünteetiliste andmete tootmine masinõppe abil, rakendades privaatsuskaitse tehnoloogiaid. Unistame Eestist, kus firmad saavad turvaliselt katsetada oma masinõppemeetodeid. Selles helesinises unistuses on Eestis katsepolügoonid, kus algoritmid saavad tulla andmete juurde. Teistpidi on privaatsuskaitse tehnoloogiaid rakendades võimalik toota häid sünteetilisi andmeid, mis võivad minna algoritmide juurde, et andmeteadlased saaksid kasutada oma tavapäraseid tööriistu masinõppes.
Nüüd on mul hea meel jagada.
And now it's a pleasure for me to share the stage with the talented young people, Mailis Orgi-Sander Cibulski and Andre Busch. You are IT students and you have been inventing something that supports us in the energy area. First, I would like to ask you to applaud to Mari-Liis and Sander, because they have just won Eurodecathlon. And this is really fantastic. Please tell us, what did you do specifically? We had a project in software development studies that would lead to saving of energy in public buildings. Savings were supposed to be made on the systems of air exchange, and we used the data that we got from our partner companies, and using AI, we elaborated a system that helps us to save energy in ventilation systems. How does it work? Well, nowadays in bigger buildings and in shopping centers, there is always a ventilation system, and there are also sensors of CO2 and temperature. And our sensors, they are using the parameters of CO2 and temperature in order to predict how many people will be present in the room. And we have 3 levels: low, average, and high. And according to the number of people in the room, our model regulates the ventilation system. So let's say that in this room right now, ventilation is on and it's on high level, but when we will leave, then the ventilation system will also start working on a lower level. So how did you think about this idea? This idea was in fact suggested to us. But you managed to create or elaborate this idea. But if this would be suggested to me, I wouldn't be able to do it. Well, we were reading scientific literature first and then defined which methods would be applicable in our case. Has your system been implemented already somewhere? No, not yet, because in this field, this is the first method, and as far as we know, it hasn't been implemented anywhere yet. But what is your opinion in 1 year's time? Do you think that your system could be already in use in this building? Yes, why not? Is this model fully ready now? No, not yet. We have to continue working on it. But Andre, in your case, your student work already has been implemented. A big energy company realized that this is a solution that really is good to be implemented. Yes, my work started with that. With wind energy, we never know how much wind there will be blowing. And this is also true about any other type of renewable energy. And this is also why trade with this energy is complicated. We have to know how much we will sell, but we don't know how much wind we will have available, which creates quite a strong risk for the producer. But my work was mainly about us knowing that we are not aware of how much wind will be available. And then my work was how to combine in an optimal way available energy on the market, because we will not be able to predict 100% how much wind energy is available. And through this, we are making wind energy cheaper. So your solution can indirectly be also felt financially. Well, yes, in an indirect way and long term, because it's mainly about companies who invest into windmills, and through this area will be able to develop faster. Would you say that weather forecasts are also important, like there are weather forecasts we hear on daily basis, or is it forwarded also to the wind energy producers? Yes, definitely. It's one of the input data, and I proceed from this data, and I also have looked at systematic mistakes that are made in making prognosis about the wind. And due to electronicals, there are some systematic mistakes in the system. So you could say, based on your data knowledge, that the prognosis of our weather forecasters are not very exact. Well, in a way, yes. So wind energy is the future, and we will definitely have at some point also really big wind parks. Can it be used in both smaller and bigger wind parks? Absolutely. And this model has been elaborated in a very modular way. So in redesigning these modules a little bit, we can use it on different wind parks. And the more we will have of this kind of renewable energy, the more complicated the system will be, and we will have to manage this system all the time. So we need this kind of solutions. Will this also will this also help to store the energy? That is one of the main problems. Well, not necessarily, not directly, but storing is problematic because it is expensive, and indirectly it helps also to solve the problem of storing because it makes energy cheaper and it helps also to administrate the system better. I'm now looking into the audience. Does anybody have questions to the students? Any additional questions that I did not ask? So it seems like there are no questions from the audience. In that case, I will ask the next question as well. Do you think that there is a need for further solutions using AI in renewable energy? What do you think, Sander? To be honest, I haven't really been thinking on this. We just had this project, and as a part of these projects, we were only thinking about this specific topic. But one of the options would be, as this time we were thinking about how to save energy in bigger buildings, but in the future we could also create smaller systems for saving of energy in private homes, for example. Yes, we could save money, especially when considering our energy prices nowadays. You have to offer this also to the Estonian government. Mailis, do you have any other idea? Well, any systems that work according to a certain timetable. Let's say transport or bus timetables, and one could elaborate a system where the public transport system would work more according to the real need. Or let's say also the system of lighting up the streets. Andri, do you have any other suggestions? I do agree that we should work in this direction, that if we would like to start using more renewable energy in order to use this 0 point, we have to be flexible and we have to manage this system smartly. So we have two options. Either we can do it in a smart way or in an expensive way. So, for example, using gas is expensive, but to use renewable energy, we have to do it in a smart way, using electric cars and how to manage the whole system when production of electric energy is decreasing and the prices are going up. So the whole system has to be managed in a smart way. Well, here you are talking about the system, how new ideas have to be implemented. When talking about these innovative ideas to your grandmothers and to other social groups, would you say that their understandings about these questions is different? Well, I think that it all depends on the background of the people and their understandings, and they probably know the word saving. So it's important to start from the right end. I do agree also with Sander, and I think that it is possible to explain things in an easy, not complicated way. It's not a problem, and when explaining things, it becomes more and more understandable for oneself as well. Now, you have come out with this innovative idea. Do you see this as your doorway to the future and the way of becoming rich? Nobody wants to answer. Sander, please. I can't really answer this question. Maybe Mailis can answer this question. My background is electronics, in fact, but I can see options for using AI in my work, how to optimize my electronic schemes. Andri, have you already been recruited by an energy company, or are you going to create your own company for your ideas to stay with you? For me, the main thing is my ideas to be used for the good of mankind. I'm a fan of this area. I'm proud of my work, and I would really love to see it to be implemented. Mailis and Sander, you will also travel to the European Parliament and talk there about your ideas. What kind of feedback do you expect from there? We really hope that we will be heard and that we will be given a possibility to develop further our project and that it will be used. I do agree as well. Okay, thank you very much, and I hope that you will continue developing your innovative idea. But we are now going to continue with the topic of AI, and Christian Port, who is the next speaker, and I'd like to warn you that there is a very special slide in the presentation of Christian Port.
Aitäh!
Thank you. Although you were giving a warm hand to the previous speakers, but I also acknowledge that you welcomed me as well. You might have noticed that Anna and Gert both introduced themselves as people. What do you think? How convincing would an AI be in introducing themselves? Probably quite convincing, and maybe it would also try to show that they are a person like Pavel was. Maybe it's a propaganda event in a sense as well, with a meaning or with a message that take it easy, AI is under control, we are developing it together, no need to worry, no need to waste your energy on it. Considering that Gert also promised that things will become cheaper and more available, these are all the things that we want to achieve. The title of my presentation is in English, Why Me? Different explanations to the title. First of all, we are understanding that more and more challenges are local, but they are being replaced by foreign challenges that are, so to say, invading our space. And we could say that this is not my problem, I will not have to deal with it. Why is the title in English? Why me? Actually, we will have to understand other languages more, not only in being able to converse in these languages, but being able to understand the different value systems, for example, that of engineers. If we trust engineers with creating a very powerful tool such as AI is, then we might forget that all the other tools might be impacted by it. And if we don't take that into account, we might be postponing the crisis, which would accelerate the problems until they get very serious, and we would see very deep social problems occurring. And always people think whether we could not predict some things from happening. Nevertheless, life becomes more and more complex, and we should be conversing more with each other and trying to understand each other better. I think that some of us have also thought that we are living at breaking times. And we might take ourselves as the most important people in humankind because we are the ones that are resolving the most important problem. Of course, we are being egocentric and we are trying to see the world of the past. We think it was boring and we are focusing on the future. We know that Homo sapiens has been around for about 3,000 years, but the sharks have been around for millions of years. And we know that the biggest problems are still coming up. However, we are unable to pay our attention to these because we are so focused on our current problems. One of the very serious challenges will be that we will start to defend the future when we understand what the future might be like. And when we learn something from the history of humankind, we know that when people try to predict the future that they deem to be right, that might lead to awful consequences. For example, the Deputy Foreign Minister, Suvorov, recently said about Ukraine that some parts of Ukraine should be sterilized, otherwise it would threaten the future. And we know that when we are talking about threats, then these might be outside the engineering sector, and this might be the communication we will have to develop. You're talking to me. Who else are you talking to? This is one of the most well-known memes from the taxi driver with Robert De Niro, where the guy himself decided to face the problems of the world in a violent way. Rather, the question is, why me? Me, because the problem is not outside of us, the problem is about me. The problems are so new that we have not had the time to train specialists because we lack experience in solving the new problems. It takes a long time to develop specialists, so educate them. And we know that the medical sector is about 2,000 years old and the doctors are already struggling. I apologize, but I will use a violent word. You can see Holofernes on this image. That is threatening the whole city. And Julia is presenting herself as a very attractive woman. She gets quite close to Holofernes and they end in quite a violent way. And this is the message that that I'm trying to convey. The AI is showing very pleasant messages, but damn, we don't even understand women, and we think that we will understand AI. How can that be? Is there a red button on women that we could press in order to switch them off? When the women say sex to a guy, then the guy's mind changes completely, so you might manipulate with another by using your words. Actually, we as humans are very vulnerable because we lack experience in how the AI gets to know ourselves, gets to know us. And we cannot tell an AI how to walk, but we can tell them to learn how to walk. And here we have the quote from Steve Jobs that, yes, it is very reasonable to follow the path that others have laid before you, but all progress is made by unreasonable men. Some psychologists say that Steve Jobs was a guy that was slightly diverging into pathology in this psychology area. However, we should not be conventional and we should understand that a lot depends on us. We are this sensitive area that is facing the new world. We have to adapt it. We have to adapt to it. And if we don't communicate it and we say that this is a problem of some other specialists, then we become vulnerable. Are we extraordinary species? Are we extraordinary animals? Do we really think that we are the only animals that are allowed to predict future? 99% of the species that have existed over time have become extinct because they were unable to adapt to the changing world. Unless a person gets to know the world, the humankind will also become extinct. But will the fact that we know all make us immortal? Basically, can we decide on when to die or not? Now, moving on to innovation, we are saying that we are changing the world as a result of the innovation. For example, you might have a guy telling you that let us do this or that, it will make everything more accessible and cheaper. However, you should think about it another way, that innovation does not change the world. A person did not invent fire. A human being learned how to use fire. A human being did not invent the wheel. They learned how to use the wheel. And if we understand the world around us, we might conclude that yes, we are extraordinary learners compared to all other animals. But when we develop something too much, then we might also learn that we are not actually needed at all. Because AI and robotics and all the related expectations show us that we are not only directing the flow of energy through our body, but rather we are directing this energy away from people. So we become biological solutions. It might happen that yes, 99.9% of other species have become extinct, but we will become extinct because we are creating an AI that will substitute us. And this creates a moral dilemma. If you know it already, then what are the choices you should be making? Or what discussions should be tolerated? Will you be aggressive in protecting your future, and to what extent will you be aggressive? So we have a wonderful amount of questions, not only related to technology. Antonio Damasio, one of the well-renowned neuropsychologists or neurobiologists, has said that the humankind or the living nature on Earth is about 4 billion years old. The central nervous system, however, is about 5 million years old. How was it possible to live without a central nervous system for 3.5 billion years? The answer is that the cells that make chemical connections, they were not discovered. All the feelings that we have arise on the level of cells. For example, you might say that my mood became better, it got worse. If it got better, try to preserve it. If it got worse, try to do something about it. And here we speak about preserving homeostasis, related feelings, mobilized actions. And if we lack the cellular environment, and when we disconnect AI, including its input and output, we will never get the person-based alignment that is linked to the values and feelings and emotions of a person. And here Anton Chekhov has said that happy people can be so unbearable. This is something that he said at the pre-Facebook era. And in the States, we have already seen that the social contacts between the youngsters have become so much smaller. People are less linked, less in touch, and we might ask what happened. The reason is Facebook and technological solutions. And the Pope also asked, why are we developing the robots? We are developing them because we want to substitute or prevent loneliness. Sex robots are the buzzword now. What are they for? Who are they for? Some statistics as well. Many AI-based sex robots think that, or they are viewed as conversation partners, but here we know that Sigmund Freud or Carl Gustav Jung would have quite many things to say about humankind. So if we forget the human aspect when we're developing technology, then we lack the links between expectations and reality. And here are the results of a poll in the States. Would you have sex with a robot? Here you can see the answers, who would consider in blue, who would not consider in red. And as you can see, the females tolerate the sex with robots more. And people might view robots as quite pleasant, as conversation partners, as someone that can be switched off. And then we hear about the traumatizing experience of childbirth. We know that in Europe, many first children are born after their parents are older than 30, and we know that the number of children in Europe is smaller than is needed for preserving the European population or its sustainability. So it means that we are not a sustainable society. And what is the robot relationship impact on the people's relationships? First of all, the robots are somewhat distant. We are able to control them, but to an extent we are normalizing them. And one of the very peculiar examples is computer use. We know what a dumb user is. We know that the IT guys think that the final users might be idiots because they don't understand how ingenious the computers are. The people do not catch up with the developing computers, but we hope that the robots become more intelligent. Therefore, we see that human relationships become more and more superficial. Think of your Facebook friends. But in order to satisfy your pedophilic passion, could we exploit the sex robots? This is another discussion that should be held, even if mentally, in your own head. It is very different. It is very easy to say yes or no. For example, yes, because the pedophiles would no longer aim physical children. They would satisfy their passion with the help of a robot. But should a robot be beaten? Does a robot have feelings because it's an AI? I suggest you watch this film that is shown on the screen, where all the people or creatures look like shrimps, and we imagine that we are controlling them. Actually, we are showing how aggressive we are as species, and this technology empowers our aggressiveness, not substitutes it with a soft solution. Yet we know what we want, and this is what we console ourselves with. We know what we want the systems to do because we program them, we have cybersecurity, we want to keep data clean, but the result is that this system fits into a bigger context. And in this bigger context, you will see problems. Nobody knew that Facebook as a picture-sharing environment would become a weapon in the Cold War in international politics. Nobody knew how humankind in cities would behave when self-driving vehicles appear on their streets. We had just predictions about them. Nobody knew what does it mean to be a person if a person no longer has to do much. And we know that the system is what it does, not what we want it to do. And we should all take that into account and listen to that language. So the problem is not about them, but it is about all of us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Nüüd on kõigil võimalik.
Now everybody has an opportunity to ask questions from Christian Bork, both in workshop environment as well as the audience here in the hall. But I would like to start with a question of loneliness. We know that in Japan they are already now using robots to decrease loneliness. What do you think about using the same kind of robots here in Estonia? What kind of problems this could lead to? Well, I would contradict to what I said earlier in my presentation if I would say that I have the answer. And I have, I can recall a picture from Japan when there are 3-4 people around an elderly person being sorry that the robot is broken instead of having visited this old person themselves. But there's another example of Klanda robot, a text robot. And in the 80s, even psychiatrists said that the first robots, if a person said something complicated, said that, okay, but why do you think like this? So Landai didn't even know that this was a robot he was playing chess with. But we know that the robots are there and the pulse will go down and an elderly person will calm down. But still, if we want to develop this kind of robots, then we have to be aware that something goes lost. How much can we see it already now that the empathy of people has been changed by AI and other complicated systems? There are examples of different studies. In Japan, again, there is an example from Pepper, a very friendly robot, and kids in a store. They finally started bullying this robot. So these very old instincts, even in small kids, they are still prevailing. And in the European Union, and I think that even the European Commission has said that GPS in cars should not use voice of a female. And I have been also shouting on this GPS system saying that, where did you take me? Of course, this was a joke only. But it all shows that when solving this little problem and looking at this big sleeping room, there are lots and lots of other problems. But many people do have their robot dust machine or also mowing machine. They call them by name. Why? I think that it's a very stupid thing. Some days people might also be happy using it, but mainly they only create stress. This kind of robots should be smarter, and they only send out alarm. And as you can see, I'm now becoming already a little bit aggressive. So as the robots are not smart enough yet, we at the same time cannot see that this is an existential risk for mankind. Yes, it is, in my view, because mankind has always been using technology for either emotions or sexuality. And with emotions, we can see that we're using AI in warfare, and although there are agreements, parts don't keep to these agreements. So we are putting ourselves at risk, and we have a very dangerous partner compared to our own origin. Thank you very much, Christian, and let's give him a big hand. But now we will find out how AI will help to find out errors in hardware reliability, and it's Maksim Yanichin, professor, who will talk about it.
Kokku sõnadega nagu tehisintellekt, autonoomsed süsteemid või tehisintellektil põhinevad autonoomsed süsteemid. Need süsteemid on näiteks isejuhtivad autod, targad droonid või pakirobotid. Need saavad hakkama välise juhtimiseta isegi keerulistes tingimustes. Need autonoomsed süsteemid on tekitanud ühe kõige kiiremini kasvava turu ning on võimaldanud arendada täiesti uusi teenuseid ja ärisid. Viimase 5 aasta jooksul on autonoomsed süsteemid kasutusele võetud kriitilistes valdkondades nagu julgeolek, transport ja tervisehoid. Ainus takistus sellel edu kiirteel on küsimus, mis määral me saame neid süsteeme usaldada. Sellel küsimusel on aga mitu koostisosa. Eetika, turvalisus, tarkvara kvaliteet ja riistvara töökindlus. Just viimane aspekt on fookuse all Tehnikaülikooli uues töökindla arvutusriistvara keskuses. Huvitaval kombel ei mõjuta riistvara töökindlust alati rikked, mis on tekkinud tootmisprotsessis, kosmosekiirguse või nanoelektroonika toimuva vanemise tõttu. Need rikked tekivad probleeme ainult juhul, kui tegelik rakendus kasutab kiibis asuvat rikkekälületid ja leviv viga ei ole efektiivselt hallatud. Mille tõttu võib tekkida süsteemi tõrge. Näiteks isejuhtiv auto ei suuda tuvastada, et fooris põleb punane tuli, peab seda hoopis roheliseks ja sõidab edasi. Taolis rikke võib põhjustada maale jõudnud kosmosekiirguse osake, mis tekitab tehisnärvivõrgus ühe pihti ümberlülituse, mille tõttu võibki juhtuda liiklusõnnetus. Veider fakt on veel see, et kaalukas osa tänapäeva keeruliste ja kriitiliste elektrooniliste süsteemide riistvarast on pühendatud ainult süsteemi töökindluse tagamiseks. Näiteks kasutatakse lennukite elektroonikas ühe kiibi asemel 3 sama funktsiooniga kiipi. Põhimõtteliselt teeks kogu töö ära ainult üks kiip. Kui tuli jäänud 2, vajame ainult töökindluse tagamiseks. Sellised lahendused võivad olla aga kallid ja energiamahukad. Tänapäeval on oluline mitte ainult arvutusefektiivsus, vaid ka töökindluse lahenduste efektiivsus, mis on muutumas uute IT-süsteemide turule jõudmise ja edukuse eelduseks. Uuenduslik lahendus, mida meie tiim arendab riikliku personaalse uurimistoetuse projekti Crashless raames, on süsteemide terviklik töökindlus ja enesetervise teadlikkus. Me arendame tehisintellekti süsteeme, mis on piisavalt targad ja autonoomsed, et parandada enda riistvara rikkeid. Oleme selleni jõudnud tänu tihedale rahvusvahelisele koostööle teiste ülikoolide ja tööstussektoriga. Oleme alati avatud teadmiste ja kogemuste vahetamiseks uute huvitatud ettevõtetega ning tuleviku teadlaste ja inseneridega.
Ja nüüd on Maksim siin.
And now Maksim is here, present, and I would like to ask a question about if you are developing AI that is able to identify errors itself, are you not scared that it will be smarter once than you are? It's hard to answer this question, but generally I think that the smarter, the more powerful system based on AI is, the more the system can support us. So I would like to answer in such a way that if somebody of my colleagues is smarter than me, do I have to be scared or do I have to see it as a possibility? But have you ever ended up in situations where you are developing AI, but you cannot quite understand why the system is doing what it's doing? Because for me it happens rather often that I don't know why computers are acting as they are. No, our systems are not that smart yet, so they are not taking decisions that we would not be able to interpret. but where do you think it would be possible to use what you are doing? Well, our solutions are supportive to autonomous systems. They can help autonomous systems. And I think that all Estonian companies that deal with development of autonomous system like Starship or Milrem, 3Yacht Systems or SkyCorp, this kind of businesses, they could be our clients or maybe cooperation partners. I really hope that this will be the future. And now in the next clip we will see two professors, Yuri Belikov and Eduard Petlikov, and they work for explaining for people who have the background of social sciences as me to explain what AI does.
Masinõpe ja tehisintellekt on asjad, millest me kõik oleme palju kuulnud. Neil on palju erinevaid rakendusi, sealhulgas energiasektoris. Vaatamata nende väga headele tulemustele teadustöös ei ole neid laialdaselt praktikas kasutusele võetud. Miks? Üks peamisi põhjusi on selliste mudelite vähene tõlgendatavus, mis tähendab, et me ei mõista, kuidas nad oma otsuseid teevad. Selle tulemuseks on usalduse puudumine kasutaja seisukohast, kes tavaliselt eelistab jääda kindlaks tõestatud vahenditele, mida ta mõistab. Seletatav tehisintellekt on kontseptsioon, mida püüab seda lünka täita. Neid tehnikaid kasutatakse selleks, et muuta masinõppe mudel seletatavaks, võimaldades kasutajal mõista, kuidas see otsuseni jõuab. Sellega tegeletakse aktiivselt kriitilistes süsteemides, kus on usaldus oluline, näiteks kaitsevaldkonnas, meditsiinis, autonoomses juhtimises ja energiasüsteemides. Hoolimata aktiivsetest käimas olevatest teadusuuringutest on seletatavate tehisintellektil põhinevate meetodite rakendamisel energiavaldkonna rakendustes endiselt mitmeid probleeme ja piiranguid. Üks peamisi väljakutseid on see, kuidas kasutada mudeleid, mis on nii suure jõudluse kui ka läbipaistvusega. Üldiselt on täpsed mudelid keerulisemad ja raskesti mõistetav. See kompromiss on energiavaldkonnas kriitiline, kuna konservatiivne kasutaja soovib nii suur jõudlust kui ka täpset selgitust, et saavutada tehnoloogia kõrge usaldatavus. Siin on mitmeid lisaprobleeme. Meil puuduvad hindamismõõdikud, mille abil saaksime hinnata, kas masinõppe mudeli seletatavuse algoritmid on oma tööga hästi hakkama saanud. Teiseks oluliseks teemaks on andmete turvalisus, kus peame olema kindlad, et masinõppe seletusi ei kasuta andmetega manipuleerimiseks. Kolmas küsimus on, kuidas masinõppe otsuseid oleksid arusaadavad erinevatele sihtrühmadele, lisaks andmeteadlastele, või kuidas disainida meetodeid, mis aitaksid masinõppe otsuste aru saada ka inseneridel, energeetika ekspertidel, arstidel või sotsioloogidel.
Seda kinnitavad ka meie partnerettevõtted, et praktikas on oluliseks tehisintellekti kasutusele võtmist takistavaks faktoriks eelkõige just tehisintellekti tehtud otsuste läbipaistmatus ja seletamatus. Masinõppemudelid on enamasti niinimetatud musta kasti mudelid, mida treenitakse andmete alusel ning mudelid tehtud otsuseid on väga keeruline tihtipeale peaaegu võimatu analüüsida. Kasutaja ei tea, mis mudeli sees toimub ning mudeli tehtud otsused jäävad tihtipeale arusaamatuks. Seepärast on tehisintellekti otsuseid tavakasutajal raske usaldada. Seletatava tehisintellekti meetodid on küll väga rakendusvaldkonna spetsiifilised. Toon ühe praktilise näide. Meie uurimisgrupid teevad tihedat koostööd Eesti idufirmaga Array Technologies, mis arendab tehisintellekti meetoditel põhinevat platvormi. See aitab ärihooneid energiaefektiivselt kaugjuhtida ja seda kasutatakse tehnosüsteemide diagnostikaks. Masinõppe meetodeid kasutatakse seal nii juhtimise otsuste tegemisel kui ka vigade tuvastamisel.
Kõige suurem probleem on alati olnud see, et lõppkasutajad kahtlesid tehisintellekti tehtud otsustes, sest ei saanud aru, kuidas nendeni jõuti. Tegemist on tõhusa koostööga, milles osalevad isegi 3 poolt: Tallinna Tehnikaülikool, Iisraeli Tehnikaülikool, Tehnion ja Euroopa turgudel aktiivselt tegutsev Eesti ettevõtte. Meil on väga hea meel, et meie välja töötatud seletavaid tehisintellekti meetodid leiavad seal praktilise rakenduse. Nimelt, välja töötatud seletatav kiht suudab täpselt klassifitseerida tehtud otsuseid ning öelda, milline konkreetne parameeter põhjustas tehnosüsteemi vea tuvastamise otsuse. See garanteerib, et tehisintellekti pandud diagnoos on usaldusväärne, polnud juhuslik ning väärib seega tähelepanu pööramist.
Järgmise külalisega kohtum.
We will meet our next speaker over the video, as he lives in the US, and the expert of military topics, Peter W. Singer, and will be our next speaker.
Hello, I'm Peter W. Singer, and it's a great pleasure to speak to you about AI and our looming robotic dilemmas. Now, in my career, I've been someone who wrestles with the future, and there's a challenge in it, and that there's a belief that the future is something that is inherently unpredictable. My contention, though, is that this is not the case, that consistently when we get the future wrong, it's not the problem of the so-called black swan, something that was unimaginable. Rather, consistently, the future reveals itself in the form of the gray rhino. It's something that's big, obvious, just really difficult to look at, to face, particularly when it's right there in the room with you. So what is it that lies ahead of us when it comes to this question area if we are trying to project what comes next, especially in technology? What is that gray rhino that lies ahead of us? I would argue that it's the topic that gathers us here today. What can we establish when it comes to robotics and AI? Well, the first is, it's pretty obvious we're living through what is arguably one of the most important stories of not just technology, but all of human history. That is, when we talk about the rise of artificial intelligence and increasingly autonomous robotics, we're talking about a story that we've been predicting, we've been wrestling with for literally thousands of years. You can find mention of it in everything from ancient Greek mythology, the Talos, to old Judaic texts, the Golem, to it's also been a feature of science fiction for over 100 years. Secondly, though, we're only at the start. No other technology area is showing as much promise, is being funded as deeply, and is supported by as diverse an array of actors as this space where we bring together these technologies. For example, IDC's Worldwide Artificial Intelligence Tracker forecasts that the AI market will accelerate in the year 2022 by 18.8%. The participants in this field range from governments around the world, from the United States to China to Estonia, to pretty much every single major corporation, from obvious technology companies like Google and Baidu to companies that you might not think of as AI companies, but are big players in this space, like, for example, the fast food company McDonald's. This is also the obsession of the next generation of companies. The founder of Wired magazine described, quote, "I think the formula for the next 10,000 startup companies is to take something that already exists and add AI to it," end quote. Third, This shift is playing out not just in software, but on the hardware side of increasingly autonomous robotics in all sorts of different forms and all sorts of different locales, everywhere from the grocery store to the battlefield. Fourth, and what is notable is this move was already in play before the pandemic, but seems to have been drastically accelerated by it. That is, all sorts of roles that would have seen a slower transition to automation were put into place in a matter of weeks and months, whether it's deploying AI in surveillance to our subways to being used for grocery delivery. And again, the key here is the more you utilize the technology, the more it gets introduced, the quicker it goes in terms of not only use cases proving value, but also how you overcome various types of political or legal opposition to it. So what does this mean for the future? I would argue that it yields two types of questions that lie ahead of us. One, what is possible that was not possible before? And two, what is proper? That is, what are the issues of right and wrong that we weren't wrestling with a generation ago? And when I say right and wrong, I mean everything from the proper ways to utilize the technology, where to deploy the technology, to issues of right and wrong when it comes to moral or legal, ethical questions that might have been science fiction just a couple of years ago. So to go a little bit deeper into that issue of right and wrong, we need to understand how it's both similar but also different from the past. Every time you get a new technology, whether it was an airplane to a computer, you would get new questions of morality, of ethics. But this new type of technology is different than just the old kind of tools. It's one that is increasingly intelligent, increasingly autonomous. It acts more and more on its own. It's also increasingly a so-called black box, where its very value is that we don't understand why it came to the conclusion that it did. And so the result of this is two new types of questions that we didn't have to wrestle with before. One is machine permissibility. What should our ever more intelligent, more capable machines be allowed to do? And the second is machine accountability. Who owns the technology? Who owns it in terms of the value that it gathers when it's out there operating on its own? Who owns it in terms of who owns the consequences when something goes wrong, when the machine takes an action, for example, where a human is harmed? And what's notable about these questions is they play out literally everywhere from the highway, where we've already seen people killed by robotic cars, to the battlefield, to our bedrooms. Now, what are some more examples of these types of questions and how they play out? Well, one clearly coming issue that we have to wrestle with is the central issue of algorithmic bias. That is, where we don't explicitly teach or train our system to be biased. We don't teach it, for example, to be racist, but it yields biased outcomes. As an example, the Amazon company tried to use an AI to build a resume screening tool. And its hope was that it could make the job of sorting through job applications much more efficient, time savings. The problem is that over time, the machine taught itself not only to tilt towards advising hiring more men, but it even taught itself workarounds, for example, factoring in proxies for gender, like whether the applicant went to a women's college. No one told it to do this, to downgrade someone who went to a women's college. It just taught itself that based off of biased training data. We've seen other examples that might loom in terms of teaching from battlefield experience. For example, right now in the United States military, we are training up AI in terms of providing courses of action, recommendations in headquarters based off of the fire orders from Afghanistan, which we have literally thousands of hours of tapes of them. Now, on one hand, it's going to yield, again, more efficiency. On the other hand, you have the challenge that maybe the way that we used weaponry and how we authorized weaponry in the Afghan war is different from how you might utilize it, say, in a war with a Russia or a China. Here again, the issue is not just whether there will be bias or mistakes, but how do we handle those bias or mistakes? To give you a different military example, there is a program to bring into tactical operating centers, the headquarters, a military version of a Waze map. This is where it will, much like giving you advice on where to drive based off of expected traffic, it will advise a young officer which route to take their patrol, but not off of time savings, but the expected casualties that they might. Now, on one hand, the advice of this system will arguably save lives. On the other hand, it's a court-martial case waiting to happen based off of what are the consequences for that young officer if they do or don't listen to their AI advice on where to take their unit, and if more or less casualties result based on whether they follow the AI's advice or not. Another issue that looms and that we have to wrestle with is data collection, security, and utilization. This comes from the ability to draw insight from a wealth of data like never before, whether it's from the quantified self to the Internet of Things that surround us. We'll have literally trillions of sensors gathering data, gathering information. AI, of course, will allow us to mine that information for new insights. One study, for example, found that it will yield as much as 11 trillion US dollars in global gain from these efficiencies. Or we can apply it to realms like human resources. For example, in our Special Operations Command, they are now wondering, why do we let people volunteer to be a Navy SEAL? Maybe we can pre-identify who might be optimal candidates for it. The point that comes out of this is that it yields a world of mass observation, akin to the famous panopticon, a building from the 1700s in which your every move was observed. Now that becomes real in our lives, but it also means that our interactions are shaped by this. On the left, you'll see a project from a work that we did, I'll get to later, called Useful Fiction, where we looked at what is this quantified self? What does all this data mean for example, a negotiation? You'll be facing off against someone where you won't just look into their eyes to figure out whether it's in a corporate or a military or diplomatic negotiation. You'll also be facing off with a swirl of information that surrounds them that gives you their life's history, to insights into their psychology, and they, of course, will be looking at you in the very same way. This is a third issue of another problem illustration. It's the people side of all of this that's hugely important. And this yields the question of, okay, well, who are the people that will thrive in this world, whether in the military or on the corporate side? How do we find these people? How do we train these people? How do we keep these people? What is the type of talent that can best keep up with all this new kind of data? And this is not just a question for example, militaries in terms of recruitment or pay. There's even issues of culture. For example, when our navies went through the transition from sail to steam, it wasn't just about, how do I train my engineers? They ran into issues where in the early years, the engineers, because they worked with their machines, they were not allowed to sit at the same dining table as the traditional officers, and their wives were not allowed to attend the officers' balls. Today, it's flipped. For example, the US Naval Academy has 10 different engineering majors. What I'm getting at is it's a question of your culture. Who do you reward? Who do you think is part of the team or not, based in part by the identity of how they're trained and what they work with. Fourth, we of course also have the question surrounding the use of these new technologies in warfare. And this is exemplified by debates everywhere from the UN to professional military journals about lethal autonomous weapon systems. Now, these debates are no longer theoretic. We, for example, have seen increasingly intelligent loitering munitions used in the war in Ukraine, which fuzzes this line towards more unmanned, more intelligent, more autonomous systems. Now, as we wrestle with these questions of not just what are the tactics, but what are the ethics surrounding such lethal systems, I think it's interesting to understand that first, we have genuine differing concepts of it. For example, at the top here, you see the US military's principles on how to use AI. You see the British military's principles. You see the OECD's. They're not the same, even though these are arguably very like-minded organizations. Even the US and the UK haven't come up with the same concepts. But then you have the second part of it, which is the concept of lawfare, where it's nations like a Russia, a China, that look at these debates and say, maybe the issue is not how do I bring ethics and morality in this, but how do I use law as a weapon, as a way to get my own advantages out of it. Wrapped up within this is not just the question of what should be the laws, but who gets to write them? When you think about arms treaties in the past, it was governments coming together. Well, now it's everything from private corporations to governments, but even among governments, there's certain governments, do we really want them deciding the laws that surround this, to even individuals. A fifth issue, not just how is this technology used in war, but could it even start new wars? What are the values that we give to our new technology? What are its rights? How is it potentially used, and how do we react to how it's threatened? For example, in the Persian Gulf, the United States told Iran, if you threaten our drones, we're going to interpret that as an actual act of war, even if there's not a person inside. Now, it's fortunate that when China did that to the United States, we took a different interpretation. And when they seized one of our drones, we didn't interpret it as an act of war. What I'm getting at, though, is we've got these new questions again that feel like science fiction, but are real. But there's a larger security question, which is a little bit more difficult to speak on. What is the impact of all of this automation, job displacement, both on and beyond the economy? Now, studies have found that this new technology will reshape economies around the world. It'll also play out at the individual level. Oxford University, for example, found that of 702 different occupational specialty job types, that over the next generation, 47% of them will face complete replacement, displacement, or large-scale reduction or redefinition. Now, coming out of that, what does that mean? What does that mean on the global level? What does that mean on the individual level for not just the winners of this new economy, but the losers of it? We explored this in a book called Burn-In, where we looked at how was AI projected to play out everywhere from companies like Amazon to how will the military, how will the police look at it? But we also wanted to understand what will be the political effects of this. And our finding was, unfortunately, more and more anger at the social level all the way down to the individual level. Our inspiration was actually from history. We saw the same thing in the last industrial revolution, where you had what was called the Luddite movement, which was basically craftsmen who had been put out of work by the early factories and fought back. They fought back with everything from sabotage in the factories to assassination of factory owners to riots in the streets. It's not well known, but actually the level of violence in Britain during this period was such that more of the British army was deployed to put down the Luddites than was actually deployed to fight the United States in what we call the War of 1812. That is, back in the early 1800s, the British Army thought the Luddites were a bigger problem than the US Army. Kind of puts us in our own place. What I'm getting at, though, is that we need to understand what it means to live through an industrial revolution. There's always been positives and negatives. They're literally landscape changing. Think about how the last industrial revolution changed everything from work to warfare to even our climate. Sometimes it was great positives. Think about on the political ideology side. If there had been no industrial revolution, we would not have workers' rights, women's rights, children's rights, all come out of this period. But oh, by the way, the Industrial Revolution also led to fascism, communism, ideologies that we'd spend over a century working our way through. So what can we do about all of this? Well, I think there's a series of action items in terms of how we need to prepare. And these are not things that we need to do in a short time period, but rather they're the type of activities that we're going to need over our lifetimes. The first is to understand the importance of education as a task of leadership. So, for example, a survey was taken of leaders and they asked them, what do you think is the most important game-changing technology out there? And 91% responded with our topic. 91% said AI is the most important game-changing technology out there. 17% of the leaders said, I understand AI. I understand how it works. What are its applications? What are its dilemmas? Just like that we talked about. What I'm getting at here is that we need to close this gap, and not just on AI, but as a leader, identify what is important to your organization, but then self-evaluate. How well do I understand it? How well do those that I lead understand it? And what am I doing to close that gap for myself and for those that I lead? Second, we need to face the key issue of trust in both its meanings. When it comes to utilizing technology well, there's two critical aspects of trust. One is the emotional state. How much I trust it, how much I'm willing to use it, how do I feel about it? Now, if I don't feel good about it, I'm not going to use it. But the second is the engineer's approach to trust. It is, does the machine's model of the world match reality? Think about it a different way. Someone's a liar. Imagine, say, a billionaire who can't help himself. He lies about everything. He lies about his golf score. He lies about the buildings that he builds. Can't imagine anyone like that. But imagine someone that just lies about everything. Now, if you know they're a liar, you would not trust them. But if you know that they're always lying to you, you can trust that they're lying to you and navigate around them. And so that's what we need to understand with our technologies is the importance of both the emotional side, but also the match between models and the world around us. Importantly, this is also what adversaries go after. When you think about Russian information warfare versus, say, Chinese approaches against GPS, they're going after those two types of trust. Third, the human side of this. If you have all of this technology change, how are you altering the way that you talent manage, your recruitment, your assessment, your assignment? If you're only making marginal changes there, why should you think you're going to keep up? Fourth, we need to change the way that we learn and prepare, particularly for militaries. Too much of what we do right now, particularly in NATO, is validation. Validating existing approaches, training to get good at that, validating our alliance, that we work together. These are important, but I would argue we need more open-ended questions, like what played out in the 1920s and 30s. They called them the fleet problem exercises, where it was trying to figure out, okay, there's this new technology. Back then it was the aircraft carrier. Today it might be the robotic ship, where I'm testing in terms of coming to new answers instead of validating a pre-existing solution. Another key thing to do is to learn not just for ourselves, but from other people's experiences. Think about how, for example, the Blitzkrieg took over Europe in 1939 and 40, and yet all of it had been on display in the Spanish Civil War roughly 5 years earlier, as you see in the images here from Guernica. So what are those equivalents today? What are we learning, for example, from the Ukraine conflict? And finally, we need to use new means to visualize and communicate. And in these new means, we can actually turn back to the oldest technology of all, which is story. We call this concept useful fiction. And it's the blending of nonfiction research and analysis, but through a narrative rather than a traditional white paper or report that no one wants to read. Useful fiction is the equivalent of what I do to my kids. Instead of giving them vegetables and fruit in the morning that they don't want to eat, I blend it together into a smoothie. And they're happy to take that kale and that spinach. And so we're both happy. I get the vitamins to them, they get the taste. Useful fiction is the same thing, but for senior policy leaders that are tired of memoranda and white papers. Let me give you some examples of this. For instance, with our National Security Commission on AI in the United States, we created a set of stories that visualized key dilemmas that they used in their discussions. Or another example is on the right here, a project that we did with the Australian military, where we took a 21-page report on the future of education and took its key items, its key themes, its key insights, and took that white paper, that 21-page report, and turned it into a story that had those insights in there, but shared them through following an officer as she went from war college to an exciting mission in the field in 2035 Jakarta in the wake of a tsunami. Did it work? Yes. Not just it's an entertaining story, but that story has been read by almost 15,000 people, including the head of the entire Australian military. We got them with the smoothie, and you can do that too. Finally, we need to catch up our laws to this new world. And I think, ironically enough, a very good model for this is how the US military has so far handled these questions. It did a couple of things. It brought together experts from a variety of fields. It utilized, as I mentioned, scenarios to explore and visualize possibilities, perils. It laid out its core principles. It linked up with other core stakeholders, both allies, but also in the private sector, partners. And then it used all of that to create a series of building blocks that are more likely to be accepted because they're shared, they're more realistic. Is it perfect? No. But getting ahead of this problem is certainly better than the approach like that we've seen from, the Elon Musk of the world, of just pushing it out there, beta testing and hoping for the best. So with that, I'm absolutely delighted that you've been willing to listen to this. And I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I would end on just this point. We're clearly in a time of immense change. Those individuals, those organizations, those nations, those alliances that look at all of this change and decide to stay still are making a choice through their inaction. They'll be making a choice to lose the future. And I hope none of us do that. Thank you.
First, I wanted to thank you for the very interesting presentation. In the Hollywood films, artificial intelligence usually becomes evil. There is always presumption that the puppet kills the puppet master, so-called. What do you think? Is this threat actually real?
I think it's interesting in that we have been imagining robotics for well over a century. In fact, it's not just Hollywood. The very first use of the word robot was in a play, RUR, in 1920. And it was taken from the Czech word for servitude. And in the play, the mechanical servants wise up, they get smart, and then they rise up. They kill their human masters, and then at the end of the play, they set out to take over the world. And that, of course, has been that narrative with us. And we see it then, as you know, in Hollywood, whether it's the Terminator or the Matrix. There's a couple of problems with that in reality. The first is, no, our machines, certainly not in your and my lifetime, have that kind of agency, have that kind of will to power, will to live. In the movies, it's always that the machine is smarter than the humans and therefore says, I should be in control, or it fears the humans and says, they're going to kill me, so I'll strike at them first. Our machines don't have that kind of will, and I don't think we're going to see that for any time soon. But the real revolution is not this killer robot narrative. When we look in reality, it's more an industrial revolution. It's more the way that AI and robotics is rewriting the code, so to speak, of our jobs, our professions, whether it's you are a military pilot, you are a banker, you are a doctor. We're seeing algorithms shape, advise, take over roles more and more. So I don't see any kind of robot revolt anytime soon. I do see an industrial style revolution, and that's momentous enough. That should be challenging enough for us when we think about the effect of an industrial style revolution. Jobs, politics, ideology. So when people ask me about the dangers of a robot revolt, say, you know what, not in your and my lifetime, maybe sometime down the road, but in your and my lifetime, no. But should you be concerned about what does it mean for the economy? What do we think about the effects on cybersecurity? What do we think about AI and its effect on social media and information warfare and our sense of truth? Those are challenging enough. So why don't we stay in reality when we talk about this technology?
You mentioned in your presentation a bit about Ukrainian war, but can you expand a bit? What role artificial intelligence plays in the Ukrainian war?
So we've seen a variety of uses of the technology. We have seen, and when we talk, there's AI, and then you cross into the hardware side, the robotic side. So in terms of we have used AI, the players in the conflict have used AI to sift through data and the massive amounts of data that are coming out of Ukraine or being produced in Ukraine and draw insights and conclusions from that. That's on everything from intelligence data to the Ukrainians utilized face recognition AI to identify Russian soldiers who had been killed. And that came out in recent reporting. We have seen it on the weaponization side. A variety of unmanned systems, not fully autonomous out there. To your prior question, Terminator style, no, but we have seen unmanned systems utilized that are increasingly autonomous, including what are known as loitering munitions. That is, it's not just merely a drone, it's a drone that you send out onto the battlefield without a specific target, and it loiters, it searches, it hunts, and then it finds a target and strikes at that target. We've seen that kind of weaponry used. We have seen this on the cyber and information warfare. For example, this was the first conflict to see deep fakes utilized in. Deep fakes are when you use AI to create imagery, a video, a face that is almost impossible for a human to figure out whether it's real or not. And they have been created in the past and used for entertainment. There was one use targeting politics in the Netherlands a year ago during the pandemic. We saw deep fakes utilized in this conflict. For example, a fake video of Zelensky surrendering Kiev. He, of course, did not surrender Kiev. It was a deep fake of him. So I think the way to put this in history is a parallel might be like the Spanish Civil War from the 1930s, where you had an array of new technologies introduced, used, that we saw there was more to come. So in the Spanish Civil War, airplanes, tanks, the German Blitzkrieg, they're all tested out and utilized. And then, of course, they have such momentous effect during World War II, just a few years later. That's, I think, some parallels of what we're seeing within Ukraine, a variety of technologies introduced, make their mark, but it's only just the start of it.
And finally, I would like to ask you, what do you think, how could Estonia become a winner in the artificial intelligence revolution? Do you have any ideas what we should do to become the winner?
I think that's a very interesting question, because I am often asked what America should do about a variety of technology issues, whether it's deploying technology into social services provided by the government, to how to better deal with some of the potential harms of technology. For example, mis and disinformation threats carried across social media. And I point to Estonia as a nation that often we should learn from in the United States. So you're not going to have in me, an American who's going around and saying we do it well, everybody should follow our model. In many ways, we need to learn from you. I, for example, utilize the type of approach that Estonia has done in creating its Cyber Defense League and bringing together government, but also volunteer experts on cybersecurity. I think of some of the digital literacy programming for citizens and students in Estonia, something that we should copy, we should steal from you. As an example, Estonia did not, you did not break up Facebook. You did not create censorship. And yet your population, your elections are better equipped to deal with information threats than mine are in America, where we talk about, adding these elements of should we break up Facebook or what can we censor? No, it's you've equipped your society with more resilience. So I think that's something to learn from. Now, that's me being very kind and dodging your question. What can Estonia do more of? I think it's...
I thought personally that maybe we could be the pioneers in the legislation field, because we are so small and it would be easy to change laws that are proper for the artificial intelligence. What do you think? Could this be one thing?
I think you've got the flexibility to, experiment more, and then both involve those lessons in your own society, but also share out and help replicate them across not just the NATO alliance, but democracies writ large. So in many ways, you can view your own country as in business, they call it an incubator, where you test out ideas. You can be a little bit more risky, but from those, by being more flexible, by testing, you can be a little bit more cutting edge. But also, I think I put it bluntly, going back to my prior answer, I think it's requisite that Estonia continue to push how it can share its lessons with partner states that are facing similar challenges. I would also say, please do double down on the investments that you're making in creating a population that is educated and equipped to deal with new technologies, particularly on the AI side. Let me give an interesting data point that I'll share from a survey here, and I think it points to where we all need to go. This topic, that I talked about in the speech, this topic of AI, 91% of leaders think it's the most important new technology out there. We seem to think we get that, we understand it. 17% of leaders, though, can tell you, how does AI work? What are its key issues? What are the key dilemmas that we have to figure out, such as algorithmic bias? That is a massive disconnect between recognizing that something important, but being equipped to make good decisions about it. Now, that was from a leader survey, but we're now entering the phase where it's not just about senior leaders needing to understand this area, it's about the broader populace. Whether you are in business, whether you are in the military, whether we're talking about our kids. And so I think the more that you can double down on your education side, that will better equip you. But also, again, I want to circle back to saying it would just be so incredibly valuable for Estonia to be able to continue to share its lessons learned and try and proliferate them across the alliance.
Thank you, Peter. It was very interesting to speak with you, and the presentation was also very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
As far as I can understand, everybody already wants to go for a break, but our last video will be about the topic of ethics, and the speakers are Aive Pevkur and Kadi Lubi.
Kas oled kunagi mõelnud, mis on intellekt? Aga tehisintellekt? Aga eetika? Järgmise 3 minuti jooksul räägime Aivega sellest, mis need on ja miks igaüks peaks nendest asjadest kas või natukene teadma. Tehisintellekti eetikast kõnelemiseks oleks vaja osutada 2 küsimusele. Esiteks, mis on tehisintellekti eetika? Ja teiseks, miks peaksime sellest teadma?
Tehisintellekt, inglise keeles artificial intelligence, lühendatult KI, on arvuti või arvuti poolt kontrollitud roboti võimekus täita ülesandeid, mida tavapäraselt täidavad inimesed, kuna need nõuavad inimesele omast intellekti ja arukust. Tehisintellekti eetika on moraaliprintsiipide süsteem, mille eesmärk on tehisintellekti tehnoloogiate vastutustundlik arendamine ja kasutamine. Nii nagu tehisintellekt on muutunud toodete ja teenuste loomise ning kasutamise lahutamatuks osaks, on tehisintellekti arendamisega seotud organisatsioonid hakanud mõtlema tehisintellekti arendamisega seotud eetiliste küsimuste peale. Kadi, mis sinu jaoks seostub esimesena tehisintellekti eetikaga?
Minu esimene mõte on see, kuidas leida tasakaal teadlase uudishimu ja uue avastamise ning võimaliku kahju tegemise vahel. Teadlasel on vastutus kaitsta inimest, aga eelkõige neid, kes mingil põhjusel ei saa ise enda eest seista. Näiteks haavatavaid gruppe, kas eelarvamuste või diskrimineerimise eest. Tehisintellekti arendamine ja kasutamine on meie tulevik, aga kuidas arendada teadlastes ja kasutajates oskust näha tehisintellekti suunatud ja etteantud valikute taha. Konkreetselt peavad tehnoloogia arendajad arvestama inimestega, kes kuuluvad erinevatesse etnilistesse ja rassilistesse gruppidesse või oskama näha, kuidas AI käitub erinevast soost või vanusest inimestega. Kui me räägime ka mõnest tervisetehnoloogiast, siis on sealgi vaja, et arvestatakse inimeste erinevuste ja vajadustega. Aga tead, mis mind murelikuks teeb? Meie tehnooptimism ja vähene teadlikkus sellega seotud ohtudest. Mõtleme sellele, mis ümbritseb meid igapäevaselt, kodus, tööl. Mis läheb meile korda? Tervis, haridus. Me usume, et tehnoloogia teeb meie eest ära töö ja tehisintellekt teeb meie eest ära mõtlemise töö.
Tehisintellektist on inimkonnale kasu siis, kui me ei suhtu sellesse emotsionaalselt, vaid ratsionaalselt. Tehisintellekti rakendamisel on palju positiivseid tulemusi. ÜRO andmetel saab üle 11 miljoni noore tehisintellekti kasutavatest programmidest abi, et lõpetada oma kooliõpingud. Ülemaailmse COVID-pandeemia leviku andmete kogumisel ja modelleerimisel ning vaktsiinide väljatöötamisel on tehisintellekt olnud asendamatu. AI-tehnoloogiate mõju majandusele on selges kasvutrendis. Lisaks mõtlemisele on tehisintellekt loov. 2016. aastal loodi tehisintellekti abil ja 3D-printerit kasutades uus Rembrandti maal.
Tehisintellekti negatiivsete külgedega puutume tavaliselt kokku selle rakendamisel. Kui AI-põhised algoritmid otsustavad, et ei saa laenu või teid ei valita mõnele töökohale või olete tõenäoliselt kurjategija. Tänases energiakriisis ei ole vähetähtis, et tehisintellekti kasutamiseks vajalike andmete hoiustamine ja kasutamine nõuab juba pea 10% globaalsest energiakulust. Lisaks suurendab AI-tehnoloogiate suurem kasutamine sugudevahelist majanduslikku ebavõrdsust. Tehisintellekti arendamine veab uut majanduskasvu, kuid kuna valdkonnas tegutseb ainult 22% naisi, ei saa nad majandusedust osa.
Nimetatud probleemid on tehisintellekti eetikaprobleemid, kuna need kahjustavad mingit inimkonnale olulist väärtust, õiglust, võrdset kohtlemist, ligipääsu hüvedele. Tehisintellekti arendamisest tekkivate võimalike kahjude vältimiseks on oluline, et teadlased, insenerid, disainerid, kõik teised osapooled teadvustaksid riske ja tegeleksid nendega ennetavalt. Tehisintellekt peab olema inimkeskne ja teenima inimkonna heaolu. Tehisintellekti arendajate abiliseks eetiliste valikute tegemisel on erinevad juhtnöörid ja eetikakoodeksid. UNESCO soovitab tehisintellekti eetika arendamisel edendada järgmisi väärtuseid. Inimõiguste, peamiste vabaduste ja väärikuse austamine, kaitse ja edendamine, keskkonna ja ökosüsteemide õitseng, mitmekesisuse kaasatuse tagamine, rahumeelsetes, õiglastes ja sidusates ühiskondades elamine. Kui arendada tehisintellekti, mõtle, kas loodav toode või teenus edendaks või kahjustaks mõnda nimetatud väärtust. Kui on oht, et toode või teenus võib kahju tuua, on teadlase, inseneri või iga teise osapoole kohustus kriitiliselt analüüsida oma tegevust. Teadlaseid abistavad selles eetikakomiteed. Tallinna Tehnikaülikoolis on akadeemilise eetikakomitee just selline koht, kus tegutsevad inimesed igast teaduskonnast ja üle ülikooli ning kelle üheks ülesandeks on toetada teadlaseid eetilisel tegutsemisel.
Nüüd on ka Aive Pevkur siin kohal.
Aive Pevkur has now come to the stage. I would like to ask, while journalists do have an ethical code of behavior, do you think that people dealing with AI could have something of the same kind? First, I would like to thank all previous speakers, because you might have noticed that all previous speakers also named ethics. And it made me really glad, because we are not talking about AI here today. We are more talking about human beings. And you might think that human beings do have ethical codes, but AI doesn't. There are many different kinds of ethical codes, and these codes might affect engineers in such a way that if you are developing AI, and we do it in the way as it says in the legislation, then we try to keep us to certain values. In Estonia, engineers do have codes of ethics, but they have been adopted for so many years ago that back then nobody knew anything about artificial intelligence. But what should we do? Because we do have very many ethical codes all over different professions. I think that we should think, and it's important that the ones who are developing AI should consider these aspects and be aware of them. UNESCO's values are directed towards bringing value, not hurting, and ethical codes generally also have the same principle. Thank you very much, Aive, and let's give her a big hand. And now we will have 10 minutes for an energy break, and see you soon again.
Kristjan, Agatina. Ja rangid. Ja massaaži.
Tehisintellekt on sinu sõber. Pane end kirja Elements of AI tasuta veebikursusele ja vaata lähemalt.
Kestlikud tehnoloogiad, linnad ja transport, jätkusuutlik äri ja puhas toit, usaldusväärne tehisintellekt. Alusta lahenduste otsimist ja mõtle suurelt. Tallinna Tehnikaülikooli uksed on tulevikutegijatele avatud.
Tere! Mina olen Jaan-Hendrik Murumets. Ma olen Kraakuli tegevjuht ja olen lõpetanud Tallinna Tehnikaülikooli elektroonika ja telekommunikatsiooni eriala. Ma tulin seda eriala õppimast. Mulle meeldib enda kätega asju teha. Mulle meeldib asju tükkideks võtta, vaadata, kuidas nad on ehitatud ja mulle meeldib ise asju luua. Elektroonika on väga lai valdkond, kus on väga palju erinevaid töökohti, väga palju erinevaid väljakutseid, väga palju viise, kuidas ennast teostada. Siin on ruumi väga paljude erinevate inimtüüpide jaoks, erinevate töökohtade jaoks. Ja need inimesed töötavad koos, õpivad uusi asju, rakendavad oma teadmisi selleks, et ehitada lahendusi, mis jõuavad igale poole maailmas ja muudavad inimeste elu paremaks. Tehnikaülikooli astudes töötasin juba erialal. Meie ettevõte hakkas kiiresti kasvama ja meil oli vaja uusi inimesi leida. Meie jaoks oli väga mugav kaasata kohe minu kursakaaslasi, kes olid juba natukene erialaga kokku puutunud ja olid huvitatud uutest väljakutsetest. Ülikooli ajal tööl käies said nad võimaluse enda teoreetilisi teadmisi kinnistada ja samale teoreetilistele teadmistele uusi väljakutseid leida. Mäletan ühte lugu, kus istusime elektroonikadisaini praktikumis ja õppejõud küsis, et kes on varem sellega kokku puutunud. Paar inimest tudengivormelist tõstsid käe ja ütlesid, et nemad on. Selle peale röökisin üle klassi, et te tööd ei taha või? Võin uhkusega öelda, et mõlemad inimesed on minu kolleegid olnud. Meie meeskonna jaoks on täitunud iga inseneri unistus. Me oleme esimesed eestlased, kes saadavad midagi kuu peale. See kaamera võtab osa ülejärgmise aasta NASA missioonist. Kui sa tahad teha sama lahedad asju, tule õpi riistvararendust ja programmeerimist.
Härra Toomas, sa oled täna juba istunud 4 tundi ja 26 minutit. Käi jala.
Mis asja? Noh, tulevikus on nii, et kõik seadmed muretsevad sinu tervise pärast. Tere, kes te olete ja millega te tegelete?
Mina olen Ivo Fridolin ja töötan TalTechi Tervisetehnoloogiate Instituudis, kus me arendame välja uusi seadmeid, mis aitavad muuta inimeste elu tervislikuks ja turvaliseks.
Aga mille jaoks see riietus siis on?
See on nimetatud tark töörõivas. See aitab meil mõõta, kas inimene seisab, kõnnib, jookseb või hoopis kukub. Väga kasulik abivahend ohtlikes tingimustes töötajatele, näiteks laevatöötajatele või siis Päästeametis metsatulekahjudes kustutajatele.
Vaatame, kas töötab. See on eriti hea ülemusele. Helista, vaatan, et jälle pikutad või? Ja see on siis mingi uus moodne müts.
Selle mütsi küljes on andurid ja see mõõdab aju elektrilisi signaale, mille põhjal me saame hinnata stressi ja depressiooni taset.
Kui tal mingi stress on, siis see on koolist, meil kodus on kõik korras.
Mida need kõik masinad siin teevad?
See konkreetne aparaat on pulsianalüsaator. Selle abil me saame hinnata sinu issi veresoonte vanust.
Et ma olen 35, aga veresooned on 60.
Isa, mida vähem autoga sõidad, seda parem. Aga milline on elu aastal 2050? On meil veel näiteks pulsikellad või hoopis midagi muud?
No kindlasti muutuvad kõik need andurid palju väiksemaks. Ja pulsikellade asemel on võib-olla sõrmused või kõrvarõngad või midagi veel pisemat. Ja kõik need andurid on haigusepõhisemad. Näiteks nad võimaldavad mõõta parameetreid, mis on seotud kas siis stressi või diabeediga. Ja võib-olla me siis oskame ehitada sellised väikeseid laboreid, mis võtavad kehavedelikke proove ja analüüsivad neid.
Kristjan, aga tina? Ja rangid? Ja massaaži?
Tehisintellekt on sinu sõber. Pane end kirja Elements of AI tasuta veebikursusele ja vaata lähemalt.
Kestlikud tehnoloogiad, linnad ja transport, jätkusuutlik äri ja puhas toit, usaldusväärne tehisintellekt. Alusta lahenduste otsimist ja mõtle suurelt. Tallinna Tehnikaülikooli uksed on tulevikutegijatele avatud.
Tere! Mina olen Jaan-Hendrik Murumets. Ma olen Kraakuli tegevjuht ja olen lõpetanud Tallinna Tehnikaülikooli elektroonika ja telekommunikatsiooni eriala. Ma tulin seda eriala õppimast. Mulle meeldib enda kätega asju teha. Mulle meeldib asju tükkideks võtta, vaadata, kuidas nad on ehitatud ja mulle meeldib ise asju luua. Elektroonika on väga lai valdkond, kus on väga palju erinevaid töökohti, väga palju erinevaid väljakutseid, väga palju viise, kuidas ennast teostada. Siin on ruumi väga paljude erinevate inimtüüpide jaoks, erinevate töökohtade jaoks. Ja need inimesed töötavad koos, õpivad uusi asju, rakendavad oma teadmisi selleks, et ehitada lahendusi, mis jõuavad igale poole maailmas ja muudavad inimeste elu paremaks. Tehnikaülikooli astudes töötasin juba erialal. Meie ettevõte hakkas kiiresti kasvama ja meil oli vaja uusi inimesi leida. Meie jaoks oli väga mugav kaasata kohe minu kursakaaslasi, kes olid juba natukene erialaga kokku puutunud ja olid huvitatud uutest väljakutsetest. Ülikooli ajal tööl käies said nad võimaluse enda teoreetilisi teadmisi kinnistada ja samale teoreetilistele teadmistele uusi väljakutseid leida. Mäletan ühte lugu, kus istusime elektroonikadisaini praktikumis ja õppejõud küsis, et kes on varem sellega kokku puutunud. Paar inimest tudengivormelist tõstsid käe ja ütlesid, et nemad on. Selle peale röökisin üle klassi, et te tööd ei taha või? Võin uhkusega öelda, et mõlemad inimesed on minu kolleegid olnud. Meie meeskonna jaoks on täitunud iga inseneri unistus. Me oleme esimesed eestlased, kes saadavad midagi kuu peale. See kaamera võtab osa ülejärgmise aasta NASA missioonist. Kui sa tahad teha sama lahedaid asju, tuleõppe riistvaraarendust ja programmeerimist.
Härra Toomas, sa oled täna juba istunud 4 tundi ja 26 minutit. Käi jala.
Mis asja?
Noh, tulevikus on nii, et kõik seadmed muretsevad sinu tervise pärast. Tere, kes te olete ja millega te tegelete?
Mina olen Ivo Fridolin ja töötan TalTechi tervisetehnoloogiate instituudis, kus me arendame välja uusi seadmeid, mis aitavad muuta inimeste elu tervislikuks ja turvaliseks.
Aga mille jaoks see riietus siis on?
See on nimelt...
See on eriti hea ülemusele. Helista, vaatan, et jälle pikutad või? Ja see on siis mingi uus moodne müts.
Selle mütsi küljes on andurid ja see mõõdab aju elektrilisi signaale, mille põhjal me saame hinnata stressi ja depressiooni taset.
Kui tal mingi stress on, siis see on koolist, meil kodus on kõik korras.
Mida need kõik masinad siin teevad?
See konkreetne aparaat on pulsianalüsaator. Selle abil me saame hinnata sinu issi veresoonte vanust.
Et ma olen 35, aga veresooned on 60.
Isa, mida vähem autoga sõidad, seda parem. Aga milline on elu aastal 2050? On meil veel näiteks pulsikellad või hoopis midagi muud?
No kindlasti muutuvad kõik need andurid palju väiksemaks. Ja pulsikellade asemel on võib-olla sõrmused või kõrvarõngad või midagi veel pisemat. Ja kõik need andurid on haigusepõhisemad. Näiteks nad võimaldavad mõõta parameetrid, mis on seotud kas siis stressi või diabeediga. Ja võib-olla me siis oskame ehitada sellised väikeseid laboreid, mis võtavad kehavedelike proove ja analüüsivad neid.
Kristjan, aga tina? Ja rangid? Ja massaaži?
Tehisintellekt on sinu sõber. Pane end kirja Elements of AI tasuta veebikursusele ja vaata lähemalt.
Kestlikud tehnoloogia.
Väga palju viise, kuidas ennast teostada. Siin on ruumi väga paljude erinevate inimtüüpide jaoks, erinevate töökohtade jaoks. Ja need inimesed töötavad koos, õpivad uusi asju, rakendavad oma teadmisi selleks, et ehitada lahendusi, mis jõuavad igale poole maailmas ja muudavad inimeste elu paremaks. Tehnikaülikooli astudes töötasin juba erialal. Meie ettevõte hakkas kiiresti kasvama ja meil oli vaja uusi inimesi leida. Meie jaoks oli väga mugav kaasata kohe minu kursakaaslasi, kes olid juba natukene erialaga kokku puutunud ja olid huvitatud uutest väljakutsetest. Ülikooli ajal tööl käies said nad võimaluse enda teoreetilisi teadmisi kinnistada ja samale teoreetilistele teadmistele uusi väljakutseid leida. Mäletan ühte lugu, kus istusime elektroonikadisaini praktikumis ja õppejõud küsis, et kes on varem sellega kokku puutunud. Paar inimest tudengivormelist tõstsid käe ja ütlesid, et nemad on. Selle peale röökisin üle klassi, et te tööd ei taha või? Võin uhkusega öelda, et mõlemad inimesed on minu kolleegid olnud. Meie meeskonna jaoks on täitunud iga inseneri unistus. Me oleme esimesed eestlased, kes saadavad midagi kuu peale. See kaamera võtab osa ülejärgmise aasta NASA missioonist. Kui sa tahad teha sama lahedad asju, tule õpi riistvararendust ja programmeerimist.
Härra Toomas, sa oled täna juba istunud 4 tundi ja 26 minutit. Käi jala.
Mis asja?
Noh, tulevikus on nii, et kõik seadmed muretsevad sinu tervise pärast. Tere, kes te olete ja millega te tegelete?
Mina olen Ivo Fridolin ja töötan TalTechi tervisetehnoloogiate instituudis, kus me arendame välja uusi seadmeid, mis aitavad muuta inimeste elu tervislikuks ja turvaliseks.
Aga mille jaoks see riietus siis on?
See on nimetatud tark töörõivas. See aitab meil mõõta, kas inimene seisab, kõnnib, jookseb või hoopis kukub. Väga kasulik abivahend ohtlikes tingimustes töötajatele, näiteks laevatöötajatele või siis Päästeametis metsatulekahjudes kustutajatele.
Vaatame, kas töötab. See on eriti hea ülemusele. Helista, vaatan, et jälle pikutad või? Ja see on siis mingi uus moodne müts.
Selle mütsi küljes on andurid ja see mõõdab aju elektrilisi signaale, mille põhjal me saame hinnata stressi ja depressiooni taset.
Kui tal mingi stress on, siis see on koolist, meil kodus on kõik korras.
Mida need kõik masinad siin teevad?
See konkreetne aparaat on pulsianalüsaator. Selle abil me saame hinnata sinu issi veresoonte vanust.
Et ma olen 35, aga veresooned on 60.
Isa, mida vähem autoga sõidad, seda parem. Aga milline on elu aastal 2050? On meil veel näiteks pulsikellad või hoopis midagi muud?
No kindlasti muutuvad kõik need andurid palju väiksemaks. Ja pulsikellade asemel on võib-olla sõrmused või kõrvarõngad või midagi veel pisemat. Ja kõik need andurid on haigusepõhisemad. Näiteks nad võimaldavad mõõta parameetreid, mis on seotud kas siis stressi või diabeediga. Ja võib-olla me siis oskame ehitada selliseid väikeseid laboreid, mis võtavad kehavedelikke proove ja analüüsivad neid.
Tere tulemast tagasi, kes on jõudnud.
Welcome back from our short coffee break. Both the participants here as well as the ones who are participating over the web. We are now going to continue with a presentation of AI expert Otto Mätas from AI and Robotics Center, AIRA. And his presentation will be about the topic that AI alone will not be able to act. Humans are also needed. Hello, my name is Otto from AI and Robotics Center, AIRA. And I have been working with IT topics and different developments in IT for more than 13 years. And the last 3 years I've been working with AI. And nowadays I work in AIRA Center, coordinating there with AI or AI projects. There are many participants in these projects, more than 2 definitely, and the leading idea of my life is that wherever I am, I should not be the smartest person in the room in order to learn something. And therefore I have left the more complicated topics for my smarter colleagues, and I myself will talk about human beings, how to be a human being, and how to be able to open this box of AI and how to use these work tools. Everything that I will say is in fact based on real life. And I would like to bring some examples as well, bring your attention to some points. Everybody know Confident Charles, and he's the one who likes us to speed, and his mimics also reflects his speeding. He is the superstar who is a gold salesperson. He can sell everything from his socks to timber in forests, although the buyers, he don't always understand why they are purchasing his these goods. So this is kind of being too self-secure. And this road is not far from Pärnu, and my parents live not far from this place behind the forest. And as a young guy, I was also thinking that if I only would be an owner of BMW, I would definitely challenge my car. But these 2 kilometers have often led to car accidents, and as far as I can remember, none of them has been lethal, but I can definitely recall 5 cases when the cars had driven out to the ditch. And today I have come to a conclusion that this is about being too self-secure, not being able to identify all the risks. All of these 5 cases that I can recall are about locals. And in addition to Charles, we also know the presuming Patrick. And we might know him. He might be our cousin also. But he's the one who presumes that if I was lucky once, I could be lucky also for some other times. So what's the difference between presuming and assuming? The ones who assume, they don't have any proof at all for possible results. Presumers, they do have some earlier examples. So Patrick writes code, and he does it well, and all his bosses are happy, saying that you can have 1 Friday free every month. And he manages to carry out 3 successful projects. And after that, he's starting with the 4th project. And this is where he starts to presume. He says that why not I could change my employer and ask for a double salary. And in a month's time, he is already unhappy, saying that nobody notices me and the projects are not successful either. And presuming Patrick, he probably didn't notice that the languages were different. Instead of Java, he had to program in Python language. So the assumptions and presumptions were different. So I have to confess that both Charles and Patrick visit me also very often, maybe even more often than I would like them to come for a visit. They come and say, hey, let's do it this way, let's do it the other way. So these Charles and Patrick, they are internally inside me. And of course, I don't want to be in the car accidents and drive out of the road, and I don't want to do things only based on assumptions. So how to find the golden path in the middle? So I inhale and exhale and think about what are the tools that I can use. Aristotle, he said for thousands of years ago that we have all of the 5 senses, visual and touching and smelling, etc. And I think that these 5 senses are sufficient for us in order to start innovating. Innovation should not be burdening. It can even be fun. If we can use our tools in the right moment, if you will use your senses in a right way, I would presume that the future is rather bright. Does anybody know what's on this picture? Has anybody seen this picture before? This is the first official picture that was taken of a black hole in 2019. Does anybody know what's on this picture? Not many, but this is the smallest computer in the world from 2015. And the big one on the left is a grain of rice. And based on these 2 latest projects that I just mentioned, I'm sure that neither Charles nor Patrick had a word. Talk to them, open your senses, talk to people, listen what they have to say and learn based on this. If you do all of this, then the next slide that I'm going to show could be your project. Thank you.
Suur tänu, Otto,
Thank you very much, Otto, for this presentation that was a little bit different. As it was so abstract, I'd like to ask, what do you do in IRA Center practically? Yes, we bring together different parties, Estonian entrepreneurs, Estonian researchers, and Estonian government representatives, sometimes also students or fans are brought together. So this is the way that we have towards AI. What are your biggest success stories? We already have initiated a number of demo projects, and we've recently also received feedback from the European Commission, and it was adopted by the European Commission. For example, we have robots in use in Estonian hospital that carry to the right destination different lab samples, or carry also food, or also in machine visualization robots in different parts of hospitals. But our next speaker will be Jan Tallinn, and he is a well-known investor. The topic of today's interview is that we should also talk about the risks in connection to AI. According to Elon Musk, AI is an existential risk to mankind. And you are in the same party with Elon Musk. Yes, in that sense, it's true. So what kind of risks do you see for mankind in AI? There are so many different ways of explaining this. But please start from some points, some examples. Well, the general attitude is that the future of our planet or solar system is in the hands of the strongest planner. What is happening to gorillas is not in the hands of humans. And maybe already in this decennium we will give the leading position to machines that are better planners. And it could happen that their understanding about a good future does not coincide with our understanding. And this could lead to extreme results. And a sufficiently strong AI can also put down the sun, because AI is interested in free energy, and this is the most optimal way to produce energy based on atoms. So Elon Musk says that during our lifetime nothing very risky could probably happen, but you are talking about this decennium. So when will AI take over? The right answer is that we don't know, but AI is not going to be more stupid. So with every day, this future is coming nearer. But there are different opinions. Open Philanthropy Project has carried out an analysis where they used biological factors, or they looked at this problem from the evolutionary point of view, where animals became smarter as they were better planners and changing the environment. And based on this analogy, they also thought the development of AI would go. And they suggested that in 2040s, with 50% probability, humans will not be the main planner. But why do you invest in, let's say, DeepMind, etc., other AI companies? It's true, and I'm asked this question rather often. And the ones who ask this question, they assume that if I would not invest, then these developments would stop. But in reality, if I would not do this, somebody else would invest into AI. And if I compare two worlds, with investors. I've been always talking to developers of AI about the risks. And on the other hand, there are also investors who rationalize the risks of AI. You have said in earlier interviews also that the most risky points are the places where AI is developed, not not being controlled. Yes, right now we live in a paradigm, or let's say that my friends have called this paradigm deep learning, and they are the advocates of this approach. And at the same time, I also know people like Gary Marcus, who is one of the leading skeptics about deep learning. And I don't know, one negative aspect of deep learning is the black box. That there are certain ways of analyzing all of this, but on the other hand, it's rather hopeless, and people are approximately in the same situation as an evolutionary process. We are doing something and we don't quite understand what we are doing. I once had an argument with a person who said that, Jan, what you are doing is totally hopeless. And why should we be developing a future that we don't understand? We should be building a better future, not a predictable future. But deep learning is a paradigm that increases the probability of non-predictable future.
Ühendused, et see nii-öelda satub kurjadesse.
Do you also see AI being used by authoritarian states, so it ends up in evil hands? I think that this is certainly a problem. But an AI that can be controlled and that is held by evil people is a better situation than when we are seeing an uncontrollable AI that takes over the world and the galaxies. And Vladimir Putin has also said that he thinks that those that rule AI would rule the world, and he would certainly want to become the world leader. What do you think? Is Russia also working on having AI that would potentially be a threat for the humankind? I think that probability is very low. Why? The people that are able to develop AI do not want to be in Russia at the moment, as far as I understand. Actually, Russia has never, well, never is a wrong word. But as for the general sense, Russia has always had problems with governing the land and realizing their scientific potential. China has also said that they would like to be the world leader by 2030 in AI. Their ambition is bigger there then. Of course. Does it worry you more? That's a tricky one. It is clear that security is an area where no innovation or no invention is needed. Rather, we could put more electrons in a box. And China would have bigger boxes than any other country in the world and more engineers that are able to put these boxes together. However, it is paradoxical that an AI that wakes up in China is bad news as well, because China is able to control what is happening on its territory much more than the states are. So from the humankind point of view, I think that the biggest problem is control over AI. and the problem that might arise from China is slightly less safe. You have also prioritized the biggest existential threats to humankind. Would you like to elaborate, please? Currently, AI is the biggest threat this decade and this century for sure, or relatively sure. The next one is synthetic biology. These are the artificial organs or artificial organisms created by people that are not naturally bred. One of the features of evolution is that evolution keeps developing different things, but in a benevolent way. Unlike people, people are not working in a blinded matter, and they are working voluntarily, which is why the potential of pathogens created by people is much bigger than those created by AI. Synthetic threats rank second, and as for ranks third, I don't really know. When we're talking about a period that lasts for more than a century, as for synthetic biology and AI, then I already spoke about the threats. Both of them as threats are less than 100 years old. Yet in the top three, you don't have the nuclear war or the nuclear threat. Looking at what's happening in Ukraine and how much it is said that Putin will use the nuclear weapons, don't you think that the priorities are different, considering what has happened in the last months? There is a phenomenon called semantic bleaching. There's a term that means one thing in the beginning, and the more the term is being used by people, the more vague the meaning of this word becomes. Currently, we see that there's a problem with the concept of existential risk. When I started to work on risks were either humankind becoming extinct or a similar scenario. Currently, existential risks refer to significant risks. I think that currently nuclear risk is the biggest risk. This is the biggest important risk, but this is certainly not the biggest risk that humankind faces. It would be very surprising. There are also some models that suggest that if all nuclear warheads were to be detonated in strategic points, then the majority of people would be killed. If any members of the audience have questions, you can post them over the workshop environment, or you can raise your hand here. Let me continue now. What can we do so that the worst scenarios would not play out? What do you think are the solutions? One of the interesting things about artificial intelligence is that we need planning, understanding, reasoning capabilities when we talk about strategic plans, and AI as well. So AI is a risk in two senses because it is artificial, but thanks to AI we are able to resolve other risks, for example synthetic risks, nuclear risks, dying or diseases. You might make death voluntary. So AI is like meta technology. It is vast. One of the problems that the security community of AI has always tried to resolve is to make AI more powerful, yet use AI to mitigate threats. So it would be an AI that fights against fake news that are automatically generated or something like that. something like that. But like I said, the bigger problem is that AI is like a black box for us. We don't comprehend it, and rather you have two black boxes. You train one black box to analyze the second one in order to understand what's happening in the latter. This is just one example. The general principle is how to combine two trends. One of them is what is happening. The second black box becomes smarter, and the other trend is what would we like to prevent from happening. So how would an AI that is ever wiser also more safe? So this is the potentially biggest solution both for AI and other risks. We also have the first question from the audience for this conference. How has the Future of Life Institute activity helped to promote the safety or security of AI? For the past 10 years, I have been supporting organizations, both financially and also in exchanging contacts between organizations that try to reduce existential risks. And I have co-founded two organizations. One of them is Center for Studies of Existential Risk in Cambridge in the UK, and the other is Future of Life Institute situated in Cambridge in the States, near the MIT. As for Future of Life, this is more focused on policy matters. It integrates with the policy communities, and this organization is simultaneously also international. The strongest organization that understands existential risks and also communicates with the politicians is an organization called CSET in Washington, Center for Emerging Technology. But this is purely US-based. They are not international, although I have very many good acquaintances here. But currently we are founding a sub-organization for Future of Life in Switzerland. So, as a solution, you think there could be a system of agreements or surveillance or monitoring. Maybe the UN could take up initiative. What do you think? Many policymakers are interested in it. It seems that it is a problem that people recognize more and more. Technology as a whole, not only AI, as to what could we do about it. And it is clear that there are also these dream opportunities. For example, if the policymakers of the world had the chance to make sure that all the graphs in the world would be switched off if things go wrong, then it would obviously empower humankind in a very positive way. Currently, this power is not there because it's based on commercial initiative, and it sometimes also contradicts legislation. But in a case there is a bigger trouble going on in the world, we could maybe switch off all the servers. This is one idea. A couple of months ago, there was a fire in a data center that could not be put off because there was no button how to switch the server off. So the AI cannot be unplugged if they go bad. No, because there is no button for that. But if you have a wise system that understands that the button is there, then the planning capacity of AI would also know what would happen if the button is pushed and it is switched off. The loss function would probably yield a better result, and the machine would then look at what it should do in order to switch the button off. But currently the button is not there. This is a theoretical deliberation. As for policy making, we know there are several norms in international law, but those that do not want to abide by them do not. For example, Russia or environmental actors, the biggest polluters. What do you think? What are the developments in AI? I think they are similar, but we need to try things out. But it isn't completely hopeless either. One of the biggest things that the humankind has been able to agree upon that was not as difficult a topic as global climate change or other problem was ozone layer. Ozone layer as a problem saw very many local incentives that were not interested in dealing with the whole ozone layer problem, but there were bigger agreements achieved on a global scale so that certain production manners were discontinued. Thank you, Jan Tallinn, for the interview. We shall continue with a panel discussion. We will shortly look at the video clip that will tell you why should IT be studied at TalTech, but the panel members can already come to the stage while we are watching it.
Me põhimõtteliselt tuleme siia, tutvume eri inimestega, nad õpetavad meile kõvasti asju, nad toidavad meid ning see on kõik juba tore.
Mina tegelikult sain teada, et kui ma valin informaatika, siis see ei ole lihtsalt mingi asi, mida ma õpin ära, vaid see on päriselt ka oskus, et see ei ole lihtsalt mingi õppekava või aine, mida sa saad nüüd ära õppida, vaid see on päriselt midagi, mida ma saan kasutada ka tulevikus teiste asjadega tegeledes. Näiteks kui ma valin midagi peale informaatika, siis see toob minule igas eluvaldkonnas tulevikus kasuks.
Ma arvan, et isegi kui sul seda kokkupuudet ei ole IT-ga, vaid sa tunnen, et see võiks olla midagi, mis sind võiks köita, siis ma kindlasti soovitaks seda, sest esiteks siin on väga toredad tudengid, õppejõud ja ka muidugi meie need kaasõpilased, kes koos meiega seda programmi läbi teevad. Et ma arvan, et läbi nende loengute ja töötubade kindlasti see annab sulle palju mõtteainet, et kas see võiks olla just õigesti sinna.
Selleks, et teada saada TalTechi informaatika erialast ning täna saan ma aru, et kindlasti tulen siia septembri alguses õppima.
And now it's a pleasure for me to be here for a discussion. It's a pleasure to welcome President Kersti Kaljulaid, Ott Velsberg, Government Chief Data Officer, and Tanel we already have met. He's a professor of Department of Software Science as well as entrepreneur Jan Tallinn. And the topic of our panel discussion is, did we want this kind of AI? Do you agree with what Jan Tallinn recently said? Or is it not that bad what Jan said? Well, I can understand what Jan says, and there are definitely also grounds for being worried, but there are so many different dimensions too, and I am also the one who is building up AI, and I want AI to be stronger, and I'm not scared about AI growing too strong in the nearest future. But what makes me worried is that we cannot make prognosis about what will happen with AI in a longer perspective. And let's say that we will not be capable of creating of AI in that case. We will not be able to fly to other planets, and the perspective of mankind would not be that positive in that case. And if we cannot control our society, and if there are just random reactions happening in the world, then of course risks will be present. But yes, on one hand, it would be maybe a risk if AI would arrive too fast. Kirsti Kaljulaid, isn't it like many other things that some people believe that it is risky and the others say that it's not? The world is full of different kinds of risks, and let's say that there are very many different kinds of labs in the world with bacteria and viruses that can break out from there, but almost never any kind of problems have occurred due to this. But it could have happened because there are people who have keys to these labs, and at the same time we don't know how far we have come with warming up our system, and we don't know whether it's an exponential process or not. And the same kind of black box is also this risk of AI, because deep learning is something that we might control or could control. It's approximately the same as control of viruses. I've always been talking about examples of viruses, but before coronavirus broke out, nobody really understood what it is about. But Jan is right. We simply don't know. We have not a clue. And these risks are not independent either. AI is probably also very much interested in energy and might realize this risk in such a way that our planet becomes not suitable for living. But talking about AI, we often hear talks about autonomous systems, but our capacity to analyze the situation is very low, which adds to the risks as well. Ott Welsberg, are you a pessimist or optimist in this question? I am an optimist, and I do agree that this development could be much faster. And what I can see today is that this whole approach kind of hinders application of AI. We are not talking about how we could support this area. And the direction is talking about what the risks are. But our focus should be how to use it in, let's say, healthcare, education, etc. So the potential is huge, but we have to understand the risks. And talking about top models and the capacity of calculations of these top models, every other month this capacity doubles. And a big analysis of OSCE also showed that energy use is growing all the time. So putting down the sun maybe is not that far. Jan Tallinn, do you agree that, or are there any bugs in this discussion? I think that there is no qualitative difference of opinion in our attitudes, but the question is how fast it all will develop, and how big is the probability of that the whole mankind will die. So it's like a lottery ticket. In my view, it's not anything that is typical of only AI problems, because the probability of that you were born or I was born is almost zero. But this is something that different, because we can create something that has the same kind of characteristics. It's not very extraordinary situation, because in the 30s or in the 40s we did not know whether the first detonation of a nuclear weapon will destroy the planet or not. But not created by humans, but in the nature there are several examples of this, because it was unsecure. There's so much insecurity of evolutionary processes. I do agree, but if it was just a coincidence that life occurred, then there is definitely an idea to protect and keep this life. But I'm just saying that we don't know where processes start and how they continue. I think that we all agree that the future is unsafe. We don't know what it will look like, but let's try to pump negative into negative insecurities, the positive ones. Well, I think that the perspective or potential of AI is much more drastic than anything else that we have had as humans. We have built up a higher level of evolution. It's approximately the same as one cell started to develop into several cell organisms, and we are now in the same situation that we are doing something totally new, because neither nuclear weapons nor biology has done anything of this kind before. We don't know what our cells are doing, and we cannot be sure about that the cells have their own wish, and we can't be sure either that we are alone in this universe. But this is probably not the main topic of our today's discussion. Yes, I also wanted to say that let's be more specific. Oit, the question to you. The question was, did we want this kind of AI, or maybe developing it we have received a negative result? What we see most is racial discrimination. It's more like hunt design. And we have to consider that solutions created by humans are not always as they were planned. Let's take paying out of social insurance in Austria. It was 10% more for men compared to women. Or let's take the next example of Holland. Also an example of using of AI in social insurance. And in Holland, money was arrested from people who really needed this social support because the system was not thought through.
I would ask Jan if this is AI. I don't think this is AI. We have seen a huge inflation that has occurred, and all the databases that are being searched and data collected from them, they are not only sieved by AI. I think that in a society of rationalists, there is the term called taboo the word. Talk about something, but do not mention the word itself. I see that there is a longer term that is decisions. It can come down to an Excel sheet. You can create macro tables in Excel and so on. You can see what are the problems. The decisions might be wrong. They might be generally correct. For example, a self-driving car might pose a problem in a trading environment. But this is not an existential threat. If Google Translate the Estonian sentence ema teeb köögisööja as she cooks in the kitchen, and if Google translates another sentence where there is talk about somebody making a decision, then Google translates it as he made a decision. As to decision making, the ability to make decisions becomes bigger in AI than our ability to manage that. But I was referring to this official from the Social Insurance Board that was linking different aspects. Currently, we are not talking about the existential threats here. At some point, there might be so many decisions that have been delegated to the machines that there might be secondary effects that emerge. For example, global warming. This is not an existential threat yet, but at some point the planet might be torn apart by it. Jan is talking about existential threats that we all become extinct or die, but there are also practical threats. And these are very different from the first. The practical threats are real and we have to deal with them. I think the easiest approach there is not to trust an automated system without a person checking the activities of that system. We know that it might be inefficient to use a labor force that much for that. Cannot we use 2 robots for monitoring another one? Well, if you have 2 bad robots, it will not yield any results. A person is much better than 2 robots. If we look at the EU approach, currently we talk about the automation of decisions. The technological component is no longer there. Yes, there are mathematical statistical models and so on and so forth, but basically we are talking about the automation of decision making. As a result, we are overthinking, we are over-regulating, and as a result, even simple automation cannot be done. For example, redirecting an email to the right person, is this an existential risk? Even if something goes wrong. When we mention the word AI, or artificial intelligence, basically we are currently trying to do as little as possible, considering the ethical problems and risks. This is fair. We must take it into account and do it anyway. Let us talk about practical threats. Kersti Kaljulaid, maybe you would like to add. What are the problematic examples for you? The main problematic examples are closely related to what Ott was talking about. It is nothing to do with AI, but rather with data use and data management. Of course, it could be done by the methodology of AI, but in this modern world, in this technological environment, we have read or we have considered ourselves to have the right to overmanage machines. So basically, we think that what is not allowed is inevitably prohibited. And when we want to integrate technology in human work, then this is limited. In German constitution, it is said that no data can be aggregated, no conclusions can be drawn on people. The Germans had to change their constitution in order to be able to develop digital services. This mistrust against the simplest form of data processing, and what is even more absurd, I think that when we talk about the Soviet time catalog methodology, that was on hard copy, on paper, then this prevents us from coming up with digital solutions. But once again, it is as far from AI as the moon is from the sun. For a long time, the problem was that AI made automatic decisions when playing chess, but they weren't good enough. So this was the biggest problem for AI machines that played chess. Currently, it is no longer possible to win AI in chess. So at some point, there was transition to AI being better than people. And here we see two approaches, two risks. First is that you deal with the current risks, that there is no analog for a chess player, as we have for self-driving vehicles that use AI. Yet there is a transition to the situation where AI becomes better than people. Jan, what do you think? Does the world invest enough to bring about these threats? We know that everybody is resolving a narrow problem, but maybe investments are made to resolve big problems. When it was found that general intelligence can be developed, when internet is chopped up in order to predict the next word on the search engine when you're typing in something, then I think that currently there are numerous people trying to resolve many things. Listening to your discussion, I came to a paradoxical idea. If we want to postpone existential threat, maybe it would be useful if many practical risks were to realize. If self-driving cars kill people and governments keep falling, we would really struggle. Well, when things like that would happen, it would be because the machines are not competent enough. If we look at poll results, then we see that the Chinese as a nation are quite positive about AI, and the Westerners are quite anxious. I think that all policy making currently is based on the lack of experience. People just presume that something could be done. We should have legislation created based on practical experience so that the risks would not potentially realize. But this is the biggest problem of our era. When the traffic regulations were developed back in the day, then it was still 100 years before we got to the German Autobahn. Currently, when we are shaping people's opinions based on technological advances quicker, or trying to do it quicker than the technological cycles work, then this is not reasonable at all. Like Jan was saying, we should imagine that we have this general artificial intelligence, and we should create international legislation that corresponds to it. And then that would cover the more narrow technological aspects as well. Generally, there are two ways for shaping the future in a better way. First is to experiment. If something goes wrong, you do it again, you do it better. And there are also some pivotal technologies, for example, the nuclear technology, where the first test might mean that this is the end. And you cannot only count on it that maybe everybody will not perish during the first test, and then we can continue to test. Yet we shouldn't forget whether we are capable enough to do it all. I feel that we are not. If Jan is unable to invest in everything, and if we are not building quickly enough, or Kersti does not warn people quickly enough, then you would have China or India that has immense resources and that do anything anyway. For example, warfare. They develop all kinds of weapons. I think that the people will still do all kinds of things, even if we want to prevent them from doing that. when we look at the articles written about AI, then we see that the articles are mainly currently written by the Chinese on AI, and we are unable to control it. I think that we actually lack the ability to regulate something. Let us come to warfare, or the military aspects, because it is very close to us. What do you think? What is the role of AI in warfare? We know the Bayraktar drones or the intelligence systems from Estonia are used in Ukraine. We already heard that the Ukrainian intelligence data have been gathered thanks to AI or passed on to the Ukrainians. What should we think about that? Now, what do we consider to be AI? Conventional thinking is the opposite. What is happening in China and India, well, in China in particular, this is more limited and more controlled. Like in the 20th century, a nuclear weapon could not be developed without the government knowing about it. Then currently in China, it is also impossible to develop AI without the government being aware of it. We know that there are private investors in the world that have much more money than NASA did, for example, in the 20th century, which means that our biggest problem in the free world here is that we cannot onboard it in our defense industry, onboard the inventions. Once again, I say that I'm not convinced that Bayraktar should be considered AI. I think that the free world is more creative and more competitive than the limited systems such as China, but the Chinese might be ahead for a short term before the free world realizes what they are doing. What do you make of this situation? I would really like to see that AI is very powerful, machines are waging war against each other and people die less. It might as well realize the importance of people compared to the investment in technology and engineering. It isn't maybe so important as how many members you have in your troops. Rather, who has technological power would win the war. The US have a technological hegemony at the moment compared to the others. So I think that this is a rather scenario, in my opinion, but once again, it is related to risks. I think that the main threat to applying AI in the military sector is weapons of mass destruction that would be created together with militarization. If you don't need to have a person on board, for example, we know that currently Bayraktar drones are huge, but at some point they might be only 2 millimeters long, and they would be dispersed in millions at one point, maybe. My favorite example that I try to convey to my colleagues as well, when we talk about how could AI magnify our current demolishing power, is that we know that the Americans have tried to invade in nuclear systems elsewhere. But let us imagine that we have an AI in the shape of a worm that is picking around in a nuclear system, yet this tiny AI machine read an article yesterday where it said that the UN will ban him or will ban them as an AI. So what is the decision that is made by the AI, whether it will launch the rocket or whether it will defer from it, considering that it might be banned by the UN? In the old days, when electricity was invented, you didn't need to worry about whether petrol was available. Currently, the problems or threats are accumulating. The old threats do not go away when the new ones emerge. In Ukraine, we see a world war that is trying to be waged with the help of technology, but it seems that not very successfully.
We've also received some question from the audience. Are there any areas where use of AI has been forbidden? Is there any legislation for this? Not right now, but there are plans for forbidding it in, let's say, education, certain police activities, also identification, analytics of missing people, and the basic approach is with big risk. And we even might have observed requirements in this area. It's not realistically possible to realize some requirements of data quality. Or let's say that everybody who is present on today's event here, 10% of us is having wrong data in the register of population. And there are some, I think that there are some court cases also where AI has been banned, or the government has had some certain data based on which they have drawn a conclusion that there are more students in this school who can become criminals. So this kind of decisions cannot be made. In the US, for example, they have credit scoring, and then in China they have social scoring. And we have taken both of them in Europe, and these are, so to say, forbidden areas for AI. And we should have a look at what is happening in both US as well as China, and if there are risks in some certain areas, then probably there will be legislative bans also. But this is also something that people do understand. But what Jan is talking about, very often people do not understand. We were recently on a conference together with Jan, and there was a situation there. Yes, and if we look at weapons, then there are many things that are not regulated at all. We are approaching already the end of our today's event. Let's talk more about Estonia. What would you say? How long have we come with AI development? I think that we are just a normal Nordic country. We are not a locomotive, and we are not at the back part of the train either. We have lots of people who do work a lot and work with AI developments, but this is the same as in Latvia and Finland and US and France, so I wouldn't make any big difference in countries. But is there anything that we could be better than others in? Ott? Well, I think that we are not competing with neither China nor US from the point of view of resources, but we definitely do from the point of view of application. We do have also a very strong community of start-up companies, and we also have to work more with implementation of AI in industry, and Aire, person was just talking. What about legislation? So how can we put it into our legislation that industry has to be use more automatized solutions? I think that it is important for us to decide how to connect our startup community with our country. And let's say Elmo Rent company, they're not renting cars anymore, but they should bring back their cars using technology. They have to do it anyhow. And now the question is whether the legislation says that the driver should sit in the car when rental cars are brought back. So, but other part, whether we have anything unique to offer for the world. Yes, we do have yarn, but there is a lot of international capital also that is attached to him. But I don't take much international capital. Yes, from the point of view of partnership only. And we can only economically make use of our role if we will be a catalyst in this process. But what do you think? What are the biggest deficiencies in this process? I think that there will always be places that will be lucrative for IT people. So how could we build Silicon Valley in France? They say that it's very easy to build Silicon Valley, but we can't do it with French. So how to bring people together from all over the world? It is a question, and therefore I would not expect that they will be a big breakthrough for Estonia in that sense. But on the other hand, I am very proud of this strong startup community. I think that the first thing we should do is that we should flatter here the talents. Our own potential is rather small, but on the other hand, we have 45,000 square kilometers and much 17 times less people living here compared to Holland. But we are at the same time also rather repelling the ones who want to come to Estonia. We know that there are 300,000 people who work with Bolt platform, which is approximately 1/2 of the labor market in Estonia, and this has happened without the interference of the government, the state. Looking once again of this idea of a sandbox, I think that our image is strong. If the state is ready for experimenting, then we are ready for doing really big things. And yes, but we did Accelerator Estonia, and if state money, governmental money is also used for this, we could be this sandbox. But I haven't seen any discussions of Accelerator Estonia induced in the Estonian parliament. The one that I can recall is from the times of Uber, when Kalle Palling went to the parliament. So our ambitions are much higher. So we have to catch after, and it probably doesn't hinder the AI world either, but we would like to have a bigger piece of it all. Are there any questions from the audience? No. In that case, I would like to use the last 4 minutes for thinking about the future. What kind of AI would you like to see in 10 years' time? Or how should we move forward in order to make AI, on one hand, safe, on the other hand, it should all fulfill our wishes? Well, I would like to have this kind of AI that is responsible about its future steps and is aware of the final goals, and also would also discuss the processes with humans. This is my order to Jaan. Well, I should mention that we are now developing also Bureaucrat, which is a friendly supporter or helper from the state or government, who would say that, hey, where you are working now will not be your employment in the nearest future, so please take some courses. And maybe somebody will be worried, okay, I will be a long time unemployed person, so let's I'll stay at home. Order received. But what I would like to say is that my wish for AI is that the more intelligent AI becomes, the more AI should understand what is a good future globally and also between galactics, and for us to be more smart. And the last word for you, Tanel Tammert. What would be realistic for the future and would give a better effect is also about automation of software. Right now it's very complicated and it goes very slow because you have to, very competent people have to work for a long period of time, and then it falls all into pieces. So if we could take development of software into wide crowds, and the applications would become easier. That's realistic also. It wouldn't require any real AI. It's not that hopeless, and the effect of this is not that big either. And talking about easier things, I think that in 10 years' time we could have some independently driving cars in Estonia. Anyhow, thank you very much, and let's applaud to all the panelists.
Ja mina tänan ka kõiki vaatamast.
I would also like to thank everybody who watched us either over the web or being present here. And we are now going to continue with giving the prizes to the students who have won prizes in different international competitions. Thank you.